Chapter 1224. Old Madame Yi was a difficult person to deal with. She was so frightened by Ho Zi that she was sent to the hospital, so she had no idea what was going on outside. She was also worried that her daughter would be in danger, so she repeatedly reminded her not to cause trouble for Yi Qian. There was no need to mention her son-in-law, Sun Yaozu. He already knew that his mother-in-law and wife were behind this when Ho Zi said those harsh words. He knew that he couldn't casually interfere in this matter. Gossip between women should be treated as gossip between women. If he interfered, Ho Zi wouldn't just release a cat or a snake. She would probably send someone to put a gun to his head. Fortunately, old Madame Yi was clear about her daughter's family. After Yi Zhixiang was frightened by the snake, she immediately called Sun Yaozu and told him not to interfere in case Ho Zi targeted him. Old Madame Yi would definitely help her daughter and son-in-law's family from the bottom of her heart. This was also the main reason why Sun Yaozu respected old Madame Yi. However, old Madame Yi didn't have any good intentions towards her adopted son. Every time she thought about how she was forced into a corner by Yi Qian and could only stay in the hospital, the anger in old Madame Yi's heart deepened. If she didn't vent the discomfort in her heart, she was afraid that she would really have to stay in the hospital for a long time. How can you still be quiet at this time? You have to deal with Ying's matter properly. You definitely can't let a bastard of unknown origin climb onto Ying's head. Old Madame Yi's face was gloomy, and her aged face was filled with a gloomy coldness. In addition, she had been frightened quite a bit these past few days. Her round face had lost a lot of weight, and she no longer had the kind appearance from before. At a glance, one could tell that she was a sharp and unkind old lady. Ying was so angry that she was sent to the hospital. As her father, you still don't stand up for her. You've made her so bitterly disappointed. Why is that wretched girl able to take the exam safely while Ying was disqualified from the college entrance exam? So what if the governor intervenes? Do you think he has the ability to meddle in your family affairs? Even Yi Zhifan couldn't deal with a bastard of unknown origin. Old Madame Yi only thought about it for a moment, and layers of cold sweat kept appearing on her back. She was still a student who hadn't matured yet. If she didn't take the opportunity to teach her a lesson, what would happen in the future? Yi Zhifan's eyes were closed the whole time. His expression was gloomy and uncertain. He was so calm that even old Madame Yi couldn't figure out what he was thinking. Seeing that he was unmoved, old Madame Yi gave him another dose of adrenaline. She lowered her voice and said resentfully, "Don't tell me you want to give away the good stuff you got. Once that wretched girl becomes successful, our entire family can forget about living a good life. Also, I don't believe that she's that capable. Tsinghua University and Shidu University don't think highly of them. In my opinion, it's not that they don't think highly of them. It's just that they know their limits and know that they can't get in." Jade pendant. Jade pendant. It was for the jade pendant that he allowed his daughter to take the risk. In the end, she ended up like this. No matter how anxious he was, no matter how much he wanted to see Yi Qian fall, he had to endure. For the sake of his career, he had to endure. As for why old Madame Yi advised him to stand up for her, Yi Zhifan's face flashed with a trace of coldness. He slowly opened his eyes and looked at the gloomy old Madame Yi. As long as there's life, there's hope. Mom, I think with your experience, you should know why I have to endure. I've been an official for more than 10 years. Your little tricks won't work on me. Don't worry. Also, Ying's mother will be here soon. If she sees you here, I don't know how much of a fuss she'll make. He wanted old Madame Yi to leave quickly. Chapter 1225. Fine, fine, fine. My good intentions are treated as ill intent. Fine, I won't talk about it anymore. I won't talk about it anymore. I only feel bad for Ying. Old Madame Yi stood up angrily. The anger on her face disappeared as she turned to leave. Yi Jifan had the intention to retreat. If even he stopped for the time being, then it seemed that there was no way to make a move on that wretched girl. Thinking about it, old Madame Yi wanted to slap herself. She shouldn't have spread rumors about Master Ho San and the wretched girl. She shouldn't have provoked this murderous god. Otherwise, Sun Yaozu could have found someone to deal with the wretched girl in secret. Ying's tears had already wet the pillow. Even her grandmother, who was never close to her, couldn't stand it anymore. How could her father tolerate it? Did he think that she was inferior to Yi Qian? That she couldn't be compared to Yi Qian at all? Canceling the college entrance examination for 3 years. The worst result wasn't that she and Yi Qian couldn't take the exam, but that Yi Qian could continue to be successful while she hid in the hospital like a coward, unable to go anywhere. Sun Dongqing, who was holding a bowl of chicken soup, came in and saw her daughter's tear-stained face. The anger in her heart erupted like a volcano. She couldn't hold it in. That old woman was right. If you can't even protect your own child, you don't deserve to be a parent. Fine. She could tolerate Yi Jifan not making trouble for his own future. She knew that he was doing it for the family and for Ying to start all over again. But she couldn't tolerate it. What right did a wretched girl, who was inferior to her daughter in every aspect, have to hold her head high? If she hadn't been soft-hearted and taken her in, who knew where she would be begging for food? Ying, your father is in a difficult situation. We have to understand him. But don't worry, I'm not afraid of getting my shoes wet. When you get better, I won't let that wretched girl off. I'll definitely avenge you. Ying, who had been crying with her eyes closed, suddenly opened them. Her bloodshot eyes were filled with viciousness that made people panic. Her hands gripped the snow-white bedsheet tightly, and she said word by word, "Mom, I won't let her off. I won't let her off. I know. Have a good rest. Mom will definitely stand up for you." Sun Dongqing was afraid that her daughter would faint again from anxiety, so she comforted her with lingering fear. Drink the soup first. If you want to deal with that wretched girl, you have to have the strength to do so. You don't have to worry about anything. Just focus on recuperating. Tomorrow at the latest, I'll definitely go to the provincial first high school to make a fuss. I won't talk about the college entrance exam, I'll just talk about how unfilial she is. You didn't recognize your own grandmother and uncle, and even made the two of you so angry that you were hospitalized. She just wants to be in the limelight. Fine, I'll let her be in the limelight. Let's see what kind of trash their school has produced. Is this really okay? Could they really suppress Yi Qian? Ying, who was angry just a second ago, burst into tears the next second. But how can we deal with her? She humiliated me like that. How can I return the favor? Saying that she's unfilial and that she angered grandma to the point that she had to go to the hospital is a completely superficial accusation. It won't affect her at all. I used to think that I could use my results to make fun of her. But in the end, I couldn't take the college entrance exam for 3 years. Mom, my life is over. My life is completely over. Sun Dongqing couldn't care less. Even if it didn't hurt Yi Qian, she still wanted to scold him and avenge her daughter. Chapter 12:26. Looking at her pale daughter crying so hard that she could barely breathe, Sun Dongqing couldn't hold back her tears. The mother and daughter cried together. One moment, they were scolding the unfairness, the next moment, they were cursing Yi Qian for getting a 0 in the college entrance exam. If there really was a way, Yi Jifan wouldn't have been so quiet. If Sun Dongqing wanted to stand up for Ying, what else could she do other than go to the school and make a scene? Old Madam Yi listened outside for a while and said to Yi Zhixiang, "Go and hold your brother back. I'll go in and talk to your sister-in-law." Sun Dongqing brought the chicken soup over, so Yi Zhifan went out to eat. Old Madam Yi didn't manage to persuade him, so she turned her attention to Sun Dongqing, who was eager to protect her daughter. She had to get someone to go to the school and make a scene. Even if it didn't affect Yi Qian's results, she had to make her unhappy. The second day of the college entrance exam passed as Yi Ying washed her face with tears. She didn't appear in the exam hall that day, so the students in the third exam hall couldn't help but take a few glances. On the third day, which was the last day of the exam, the parents waiting outside found out that a student named Yi Ying in the third exam hall had been arrested for cheating and was disqualified from the exam. Sun Dongqing, who was standing in the crowd, heard all the parents talking about her daughter. She couldn't wait to rush up and fight with them. If Yi Zhixiang didn't stop her, she probably would have gone up. "Sister-in-law, if you fight now, don't even think about going in later." Yi Zhixiang held her back tightly, afraid that she would make a wasted trip again. Thinking of old Madame Ye's advice, she hurriedly comforted her. "Why are you arguing with them? They're talking about other people. What can we do? We're not looking for anyone else today. We're only looking for Yi Qian. Sister-in-law, if you can't hold it in, you won't even be able to enter the school, let alone look for that wretched girl." Sun Dongqing was so angry that her chest heaved up and down. A bunch of foul-mouthed idiots. Do they think their daughters and sons can pass the exam? Bah! Both of them failed the exam. Her voice had always been loud, and she didn't bother to hide her anger. Yi Zhixiang didn't have time to cover her mouth before Sun Dongqing started cursing. When the surrounding parents heard this, their faces were all filled with anger. Whose parent was this? A dog's mouth can't spit out ivory. Ignore her. One look and I can tell that the child at home is a disappointment. Hearing us chatting happily, she's unhappy and wants to vent her anger. Who do you think you are? Your mouth stinks. Her child is the one who failed. That's right. If you're unhappy, then go home and stay there. Why did you come out to embarrass yourself? One after another, Sun Dongqing, who was originally burning with anger, could no longer hold it in. She directly scratched the face of the parent closest to her. "Shameless thing, see if I don't tear your stinky mouth apart. Someone's fighting. Someone's fighting. Quick, open it, open it. Pull them apart. Police, where are the police? There's a fight here. There's a fight here." On the third day of the college entrance exam, the main gate of the school was very lively. There was actually a parent beating someone up. Cause, unknown. The main entrance of the school was bustling with activity, but there were also parents discussing this matter at the back entrance. After such a big incident, how could they not talk about it when they gathered together? Not being able to take the college entrance exam for 3 years is indeed quite tragic. The T6 combatant who had been with Xia Jinyuan for 3 consecutive days sounded rather regretful. He sighed and said, "That little girl is too evil. It's only right that she be taught a lesson. Otherwise, she'll really think that she's invincible in the future." He sounded rather regretful, but when he finished speaking, it was as if an icicle had shattered. It was cold and heavy. Chapter 12:27. Xia Jinyuan and Yi Qian did not mention Yi Ying. Knowing the result, there was no need to mention her. This kind of person did not deserve to appear in their conversation. He replied indifferently, "Sooner or later, you'll have to pay for what you did." Being disqualified from the college entrance exam for 3 years is not a big deal. Unfortunately, he did not have anything on Yi Zhifan. Dealing with Yi Ying was a piece of cake. The only person Yi Qian really wanted to deal with was Yi Zhifan. Thinking of Yi Jifan, Xia Jinyuan's eyes turned cold. Even Xia Yiwei was surprised by how fast he was promoted, but they could not find anything wrong with it. A provincial cadre who had been promoted solely based on his personal achievements had a clean resume that couldn't be any cleaner. The only suspicious thing was that Yi Jifan was always able to coincidentally come across major events that could have contributed to his career. For example, when he was promoted from the city to the provincial office, he was able to handle the massive ice storm properly and reduce the country's financial losses. He was promoted to the provincial office because of this one ice storm. Being too clean was also problematic. At the same time, it made him feel alarmed. He could tell that there was someone secretly helping Yi Jifan. Until Yi Qian came out, Xia Jinyuan was still thinking about how to make a hole in Yi Jifan's clean resume to find out who was helping him. In response, Yi Qian smiled and said, "Don't worry. Even if we find out who it is now, I can't do anything about it. The most important thing is to build a good foundation." With Yi Ying's disqualification, Yi Jifan would probably keep quiet and not dare to make any moves. Yi Qian did not know about what happened at the front gate of the school. After leaving the school, he got into Xia Jinyuan's car and went back to visit Uncle General. After a few hours of apologizing, Yi Jifan finally reached a private settlement with the parents and settled the matter with money. When old Madame Yi found out, she was so angry that her ribs hurt. "Idiot, idiot. Who told her to cause trouble for that wretched girl? Look at her, she's so stupid that she didn't even enter the school gates and fought with her parents. Idiot. How could there be such a stupid thing? I couldn't persuade him no matter how hard I tried. He even scratched me." Yi Zhixiang covered her face and glanced at the door of the ward. She said softly, "Mom, Yaozu said that we should go back to the countryside before second brother can react." They couldn't let him know that they were the ones who instigated Sun Dongxing to go to school. Old Madame Yi happened to be annoyed by staying in the hospital. In addition, there seemed to be no movement on Ho Zi's side, so she also had the idea of returning to the countryside. "Well, it's not peaceful recently. Let's go back to the village and take it as a distraction." Therefore, when Yi Qian and Xia Jinyuan drove back to Shuka village, Sun Yaozu also drove old Madame Yi back to Shuka village. The village was not as lively as the city, but it was more peaceful. Looking at the starry sky, Yi Qian, who was lying on a bamboo chair, said to Uncle Jen with a smile, "When Principal Chen comes back, you can play chess and fish with Principal Chen every day." "Good. It's good that he's back. Your Uncle Chen has been running around his whole life and worrying about you for so many years. It's time for him to retire." Uncle Jen sipped his tea, his kind smile never disappearing. He looked at the girl with a satisfied expression and smiled slightly. "You have to be more careful when you're outside in the future. Don't let your emotions affect your decisions. I think Major Xia, who came back with you, is a reliable person. With him taking care of you, your Uncle Chen and I can rest assured. But, you have to know that relying on others is never as good as relying on yourself. Only by working hard on your own can you have a foothold. Those who truly care about you won't always spoil you, but will remind you when you're in the prime of your life." Uncle Jen was like that. He never forgot to remind Yi Qian. Chapter 1228. Yi Qian and his granduncle were looking up at the starry sky as they chatted. Xia Jinyuan, who had gone to the army to meet his old comrade, was also looking up at the starry sky as he chatted with Political Commissar Yen. The more important Yi Qian is to the military, the more responsibility she will have. I'm just afraid that she won't be able to handle it at such a young age. Political Commissar Yen said with a mixture of worry and joy. He then turned to look at the young major who had a bright future ahead of him and joked, "Everyone knows that you have feelings for Miss Jian." Xia Jinyuan felt that there was nothing to hide from his old comrade and Yi Qian. He smiled and said, "Even political commissar knows about it. It seems that I can't hide my feelings from anyone." He didn't deliberately hide it from anyone, not even his parents. He told them long ago, in case his mother, who had a long reach, intervened before he got his girlfriend. He admitted it without any concealment, which made political commissar Yen a little stunned. Then he laughed and said, "You are really honest. In my opinion, it is not so easy to win Jian-er's heart. Even if you really win her heart, there will be changes before you marry her. A smart and intelligent girl would be popular wherever she went. Moreover, Miss Jian had a bright future ahead of her. Those young men with good taste would definitely not miss out on this opportunity." Major Xia had been in the army for many years. Sometimes, he couldn't even find someone he wanted. This undoubtedly gave others many opportunities to pursue Miss Jian. It wasn't impossible for there to be changes in their relationship. Political Commissar Yen didn't treat Xia Jinyuan as an outsider and directly reminded him. In fact, the meaning behind his words was very obvious. If he wanted to be with Yi Qian for a long time, it would be best to settle the matter first to avoid complications. There will be changes if I don't marry her, and there will also be changes if I marry her. It depends on the person. Xia Jinyuan's smile spread from the corners of his mouth to the tips of his eyebrows, revealing his reserved confidence. "I'm different from Yi Qian. We will be lovers in the future and will also be comrades. Political commissar, when the time comes, you can wait to attend our wedding banquet." Political commissar Yen was naturally happy to see this happen. He also felt that the two were indeed a good match. The man was handsome and the woman was intelligent. They had known each other for many years and knew each other very well. If they could really get together, they would be happy. "Sure, I'll be waiting for your wedding invitation." As they spoke, they talked about when they would be leaving. Then, they asked about Yi Qian's college entrance examination, as if they were his elders. "When the college entrance examination results are out, Yi Qian and I will leave. It should only take about a week." Xia Jinyuan answered them one by one, and his tone was rather respectful. "Her grades have always been good, and she has a good chance of getting into the National University of Science and Technology. The military is also waiting for her score to be released. When the time comes, there will be a series of arrangements." He didn't directly mention the specific arrangements, but political commissar Yen could tell that Yi Qian's future path would be much smoother than it was now. A gratified smile appeared on his resolute face as he sighed, "Little girl Jian has finally made it. Even if the days from now on are bitter, she will be willing to suffer. If you really manage to win her heart, you must treat her well and love her. She suffered a lot when she was young, and her mind is sharp. If you do something wrong to her in the future, it will be in vain even if you sincerely repent." At the mention of this, Xia Jinyuan's face became serious and he said solemnly, "Don't worry, that day will never come." He had seen her suffer. At first, he was attracted by her fearless gaze, then he was interested in her tenacity, and finally, he was surprised by her intelligence. As the days passed, he was attracted to her day by day. By the time he realized his feelings, it was already too late. It was so late that he couldn't restrain himself no matter how hard he tried. He could only let nature take its course. Chapter 12:29. Yi Qian was hard to win over, but he had the most say. After her resistance, indifference, and avoidance, and the fact that they hadn't seen each other for almost a year, he finally chose to take the initiative. Now that she finally relented, he felt like he had taken a bullet. How could he bear to let her be sad? The night grew darker, and dark clouds covered the stars in the sky. In the middle of the night, it started to rain, and it didn't stop until 5:00 in the morning the next day. Yi Qian, who was used to waking up early, prepared mung beans and plain porridge for Uncle Jen since she couldn't do morning exercises. She was waiting for him to wake up. Old people weren't used to waking up late, and when they heard the rooster crowing, they didn't feel sleepy anymore. When Yi Qian was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, Uncle Jen walked out of the peach forest with a fishing rod and went to the 2 ponds in the middle of the village. It was July, and even at 5:00 in the morning, there was still light. Some villagers had already opened their doors and turned on the kitchen lights to start a new day of work. The Yi family's house, which was built in the center of the village, also turned on its lights. Uncle Jen walked past the embankment and looked at the car parked in front of the Yi family's house with a serious expression. It's Sun Yaozu's car. It looks like old Madame Yi is back. No, I can't let her see Jian Yiling. Uncle Jen held the wooden bucket in his right hand and the bamboo fishing rod in his left hand. He turned around in the rain. Where are you going now? Grandpa Jen, do you have something urgent? The porridge wasn't cooked yet. Yi Qian was surprised to see Uncle Jen in a raincoat. She didn't know that Grandpa Jen had woken up early. She hurriedly took the straw raincoat from the old man and hung it up properly. She glanced at the fishing rod. Grandpa Jen went fishing early in the morning and came back without even loosening the fishing line. Did something happen when he went out? Uncle Jen wanted to hide it from Yi Qian, but he remembered that she was smart, so he said kindly, I just went fishing. Before I reached the pond, I saw Sun Yaozu's car parked in front of the Yi family's house. I thought old Madame Yi might be back. So that's what happened. Don't worry about it. She and Yi Zhixiang offended a powerful person outside and were so scared that they were hospitalized. I'm afraid they came back to avoid trouble. Yi Qian's smile was calm, and there was nothing strange about it. Don't worry. Don't worry about the Yi family. People like them are a waste of time. It's best to ignore them. She did not mention that old Madame Yi had looked for her before and caused a lot of trouble. You've already said that my father isn't her son. When my father was still alive, he had already repaid her kindness. As for me, firstly, I didn't eat her food. Secondly, I didn't use her food. She wants to put on airs in front of me. She really can't put on airs. Yi Qian's attitude towards the Yi family was very firm. He would never lower his head to them. After a while, old Uncle Jen gently patted Yi Qian's hand that was supporting him. He looked at the girl who had grown into a beautiful girl who was stronger than her mother with a kind gaze. There was a hint of comfort in his voice. It's good that you think this way. Old Madame Yi is nothing to be afraid of. She's old and doesn't have much time left. It's right not to be calculative with her. You have to guard against Yi Zhifan, but you can only guard against him now. You can't do anything. He's a person who cares about his career. Before you have absolute confidence, you can't act rashly. Otherwise, you'll get yourself into trouble. Chapter 12:30. The kitchen in the village was large and covered with black tiles. Smoke rose from the cracks of the tiles when the fire was lit. Yi Qian added 2 pieces of firewood to cook the porridge in the casserole. The fire shone on her face, but the warmth of the fire did not melt the coldness in the depths of her eyes. She pursed her lips and replied softly, I know. They don't dare to mess with me now, and I won't hold on to them. I don't want to waste all my efforts if I can't pass the background check. Uncle Jen, who was sitting in a chair, stared at the girl that he and Chen Dongfeng had trained. He coughed deeply and showed a rare look of seriousness on his face. He looked at Yi Jian, who was trying to hold back her anger, and said with a deep voice, Grandpa Jen still has one more thing to tell you. Little Jian, you have to listen carefully. Before we have any clues, you can't tell me anything, even if it's Major Xia. Yi Qian was startled, please tell me. Yi Qian didn't even recover from the burning smell of the porridge. Uncle Jen put the casserole aside and looked at Yi Qian, who was still in shock, with pity. "I'm a bit confused, Grandpa General, I don't understand." Yi Qian's usually calm voice had a trace of panic. There was too much information, and her head was dizzy. She couldn't make sense of it. Grandpa Jen said that Grandpa Jen and Grandma Yi had entrusted their only son, Yi Xinfan, to old Madame Yi. In the end, old Madame Yi lost Yi Xinfan and replaced him with her father. Before she could digest it, Grandpa Jen threw out another secret. He told her that her mother might have been sacrificed because of that jade pendant. Why was it so messy, so complicated? Even her mother's sacrifice was not simple. No, something was wrong. Yi Qian looked up from her panic and looked at Uncle Jen with her dark eyes. She said softly, "Grandpa, my father passed away in an accident, and my mother sacrificed herself in a mission. Do you remember what old Madame Yi did during that time? Where are Yi Zhixiang and Sun Yaozu? Are they in the village or outside?" It was Uncle Jen's turn to be confused. He thought for a moment and answered, "Your father passed away and your mother sacrificed herself less than 3 months ago. I happened to be in the army. When I came back, your mother's belongings were already in Sun Dongqing and Yi Zhifan's hands. But I'm sure old Madame Yi is in the village. Yi Zhixiang and Sun Yaozu didn't return." "Little Jian, what do you mean by this?" "Grandpa, I suspect that old Madame Yi and Yi Zhixiang had something to do with my father's death." Yi Jian pursed her lips, and her eyes were as cold as the tip of a sword. "I didn't doubt it before. More than 40 days before the college entrance examination, old Madame Yi broke into the school and wanted to forcibly move my household registration. In a fit of anger, I took out my parents' photos." At this point, Yi Qian felt that her throat was as dry as a knife. "I noticed that the mother and daughter didn't even dare to look at my father's photo. Yi Zhixiang felt guilty, and old Madame Yi felt lucky. So, I suspect that my father's death was more than meets the eye." Uncle Jen, who was usually emotionless, tensed up when he heard this. 3 months after your father passed away, your mother called me and told me that she was going on a mission. She also told me that if something happened to her, it might have something to do with a piece of jade. Little Jian, when your mother left the village, only old Madame Yi knew. And when your father left the village to work, only old Madame Yi knew." Chapter 1231. In other words, her suspicions were not without reason. Yi Jian, whose eyes were filled with hostility, was in a state of turmoil, but his brain was calmer. "Investigate, I must find out. Even Sun Yaozu must be investigated. I don't believe that a town bumpkin like him could have saved up such a large business. Of course he couldn't. Otherwise, he wouldn't have become a fugitive." Old Master Jen's cold words made Yi Qian's gaze sharpen. "You're saying that Sun Yaozu is a fugitive?" Even after meeting Xia Jinyuan, Yi Qian's expression was extremely cold. She had guessed correctly. Sun Yaozu was a fugitive every time he sneaked back to the village. But now, he wasn't. Grandpa Jen said that someone had helped him in secret and removed his identity as a fugitive. "What are you thinking about so intently?" Xia Jinyuan, who had come to pick her up, saw from the rearview mirror that his girlfriend had a strange expression. Although he was smiling, his eyes darkened. At 6:00 in the morning, he received a call from Old Master General. He said that Yi Qian wanted to visit the military base and asked him to drive her home. It was understandable that she wanted to visit the military base. She had deep feelings for the military base in Fujian town. Since she was back in the village, she naturally wanted to visit. But he didn't expect to see this little fox. However, this was a serious matter. Old Master Jen had repeatedly instructed her not to mention it, not even to Xia Jinyuan. Yi Qian forced a smile. I don't feel good knowing that I can't accompany Grandpa Zhen even when I'm back. Was that really the case? Xia Jinyuan didn't believe her. But there must be a reason why she couldn't say it directly. He didn't pursue the matter. He smiled and said, Grandpa Zhen has to wait for Uncle Qin to come back before we can go to the military base together. I think Uncle Qin will be back the day after tomorrow at the latest. At night, you can accompany Grandpa Zhen again. Principal Qin needed to hand over the work of the provincial first high school's library. Knowing that Yi Qian would be leaving for the military base in a week, he asked the two of them to drive away first. He would return after handing over the work. If they followed the normal procedure, they should be able to return to the village by noon today. Yi Qian did not want to hide the truth, but he had no choice but to do so. He tried his best to adjust his emotions, and the cold expression on his face gradually relaxed. Fortunately, he had undergone special training, and after adjusting for a while, the coldness from before disappeared. Seeing this, Xia Jinyuan said casually. I really didn't know that I was Sima Zhao. Everyone knows that. Even political commissar Yen saw through me. He kept teasing me last night. He also said that in order to prevent any unforeseen circumstances, it's best to marry you as soon as possible. It was easy to say, but Yi Jian was shy. As she listened, her fair face turned red. She said awkwardly, How? How did the political commissar know? Doesn't that mean Captain Liu also knows about it? Of course, I even promised to send you an invitation when we get married. His 8 characters had just been revealed, but he was already thinking so far ahead. Yi Qian glared at him. Hearing his low voice, he relaxed. The day after tomorrow, Yi Qian waited for Uncle Zhen and Principal Qin to come over. He also heard another big news. Yesterday, old Madame Yi suddenly suffered a stroke and collapsed. The hospital said that she would not be able to move her limbs in the future. Her mouth was crooked, and she needed to be taken care of. Yi Jian's lips curled up slightly. This was retribution. However, Yi Qian quickly threw this matter to the back of his mind. The military already knew about her score, and they asked her to pack her luggage immediately. Oh, she didn't even need to pack her luggage. She just needed to take the relevant documents and go with Xia Jinyuan to the naval base in the southernmost part of the country. The first page of a new chapter was opened. Chapter 1232. Shuku village had already become Yi Qian's harbor. Every time he left, he would see Uncle Zhen standing at the edge of the village, watching him leave. He missed his hometown even before he left. In the past, Uncle Zhen stood alone at the entrance of the village. Now that Uncle Qin was by his side, Yi Qian couldn't help but smile with tears in his eyes. I'm afraid I won't have many chances to come back in the future. Yi Qian wiped away the tears that were about to seep out of his eyes when he couldn't see the two elders anymore. He said sadly, I wonder if I can come back once a year. The roads from the village to the town and then to the city were mostly winding roads. Xia Jinyuan's driving skills were good and he drove very steadily. Hearing this, he smiled and replied, If I told you that you probably won't be able to come back in 4 years, would you be sad? 4 years. Yi Qian was shocked. He looked at the smiling guy and muttered, I won't be able to come back in 4 years. That's impossible. Soldiers also had family leave, not to mention she was still a student. Although he didn't look surprised, Xia Jinyuan seemed to have seen through him. His smile faded a little. It's possible. I haven't been home for 4 years too. During winter and summer vacations, my family hasn't picked up a single call from me. Yi Qian's heart sank a little. Captain Xia said that he wouldn't be able to come home for 4 years. Did she have to do the same? Why did she have to do the same? There was a lot of information, so Yi Qian couldn't help but think about it. For a moment, the car was silent. Xia Jinyuan looked at Yi Qian, who was deep in thought, through the rearview mirror. His thin lips curved up a little. With Little Fox's intelligence, she would definitely think deeper into his words. The military had already taken his suggestion and trained Yi Qian to be an all-round soldier king, so that he could smoothly enter the Snowfield Brigade in the future and take over the work of another team. It was extremely difficult for a woman to become a Special Forces soldier. Since Yi Qian had the ability to become a Special Forces soldier, the military would definitely not allow such a talent to be buried in the tide of the army. In addition, Yi Qian was highly regarded by the army major general, so it was impossible for her to be mediocre for the rest of her life. Yi Qian's magnificent military career was already beckoning to him. He drove quietly with a calm expression. Yi Qian, who was deep in thought, gradually became serious. She seemed to be thinking of something and looked at Xia Jinyuan thoughtfully. Before she could retract her gaze, the man who was driving calmly looked up and smiled at her through the mirror. His elegant smile was indescribably flirtatious. Yi Qian glared at him before saying, "Is it because the military wants to train me to be like you? Otherwise, you wouldn't have said that I might be like you, unable to return home for 4 years." Other than that, she couldn't think of any other reason why she might be like him, unable to return home for 4 years. That was why his little fox was so smart. She could immediately think of the key points after he said a few words. Before the matter was completely settled, everything was unknown. She just wanted to know what to expect. Be mentally prepared that you won't be able to return home for 4 years. At home, there's Uncle Chin taking care of you. If anything happens, I'll inform you immediately. Xia Jinyuan didn't deny it, nor did he confirm it. He maintained a faint smile, and his voice was as cold as jade. I believe you know how high the expectations the military headquarters has for you. Work hard, and I will always be waiting for you in front. When you join the Snowfield Brigade, when you become a true comrade, I'll use the best time to carve out our love. Chapter 1233. Even though he didn't say anything, Yi Qian already knew that the military had the intention of training her to be like Xia Jinyuan. They hoped that she could become a Special Forces soldier who could fight on the front lines like him. Just thinking about it made Yi Qian's heart surge. Her dark eyes were brighter and brighter than the stars in the midsummer night. Xia Jinyuan's smile deepened. The day of fighting together was not far away. Shuku village was getting further and further away from them. When they reached the town, Yi Qian saw a car with a provincial license plate parked in front of a food wholesaler. 3 familiar figures walked out of the wholesaler with a few red plastic bags in their hands. Yi Zhifan, who was walking in front, turned around and said something. Yi Ying's expression immediately tensed up. Sun Dongqing, who was walking at the back, replied angrily. She put an arm around Yi Ying's shoulder and comforted her daughter in a low voice. Yi Qian's cold gaze swept across the family of 3. She narrowed her eyes slightly and asked the man who didn't seem to notice the family of 3, Captain Xia, old Madame Yi suddenly had a stroke. Was it Brother Zi's doing? Also, why do I feel that Yi Ying was disqualified from the college entrance examination for 3 years? Yi Ying's actions would only result in a 0 score of being disqualified from the college entrance examination for 3 years. Back then, the head of the Provincial Education Bureau said that she would only get a 0 score. Who knew that there would be an unforeseen event that night? She didn't come to the examination hall the next day. No matter how she thought about it, Captain Xia had something to do with it. It had been a week. Xia Jinyuan didn't expect her to ask about it again. He answered vaguely, evil will be repaid with evil. Their family can do things that harm others. Sooner or later, they will pay for their actions. After hearing his words, Yi Qian smiled. Her gaze towards Xia Jinyuan became gentler. There was someone who always helped her solve her problems without her noticing. He never said anything. Everything was handled in secret so that she wouldn't be distracted. In this life, with such a person by his side, those cold and damp past events seemed insignificant. Old Madame Ye's stroke was quite serious. She had been staying in the town hospital for the past few days and had not been sent to the city hospital, which was 6 hours away from Fujian town. The situation was too sudden. Even if Yi Zhixiang wanted to send him to the hospital, she couldn't send him to the city hospital when he was sick. I don't know why he suddenly had a stroke when he came back. He was mumbling something that I couldn't hear clearly. Yi Zhixiang's eyes were a little red and swollen. She tucked in old Madame Yi, whose mouth was crooked, and said with a haggard face, "Second brother, I want to transfer Mom to the province to take care of her. The environment in the town hospital is too bad." In one night, her most powerful backer had fallen. Even the arrogant and despotic Yi Zhixiang had become weak. Sun Dongqing looked at old Madame Yi, who could not speak and could not walk. There was an indescribable joy in her heart. She replied sarcastically, "Your house is big, and Mom has been worried about you for a lifetime. It's only right for her to take care of you in the province." She wanted her to take care of him. No way. Second sister-in-law, don't be sarcastic. You're also responsible for Mom's stroke. Don't try to get away with it. Yi Zhixiang had never been kind to Sun Dongqing. Yi Zhixiang, you're the one taking care of her. It has nothing to do with me. You want to blame it on me? No way. Sun Dongqing, who was not to be outdone, immediately retorted, "You used to make things difficult for me. Now that something has happened, you're thinking of me. Yi Zhixiang, do you think I'm still as easy to bully as before?" Chapter 1234. Less than 2 minutes after entering the room, the sister-in-law and sister-in-law started arguing. Although old Madame Yi could not speak or move her legs, her mind was clear. When she heard the argument, she spoke in a hurried and incomprehensible tone. Her eyes were locked on Yi Zhifan's face, and her hands, which could still move, were knocking on the bed. She was hinting for Yi Zhifan to stop the fight. Yi Zhifan glanced at her. He knew that she wanted to talk to him, so he looked at Yi Zhixiang coldly. "Mom is in this state, and you're still in the mood to argue with your sister-in-law. Sun Yaozu has already made arrangements at the hospital in the provincial capital. I'll take you and Mom there." "Who's arguing with her? Did you see that she cared about Mom?" Yi Zhixiang replied fiercely. Then she remembered old Madame Ye's advice. She raised her hand to brush her hair and softened her voice. "Mom is sick, and I'm anxious and angry. Brother, don't take it to heart." Even she knew to lower her head. Yi Zhifan twitched the corner of his mouth and said calmly, "There's no cure for a stroke. We can only take it slowly and see if it gets better. She can't walk or use a wheelchair, but it's a big deal that she can't speak. Look, I can't even hear what Mom wants to say now." Old Madame Yi, who could not speak, heard him. Her eyes were filled with venom, and her voice became louder and louder. Saliva even dripped from the corner of her mouth. Yi Ying frowned when she saw her stomach churning. She looked away. She did not want such a person in the house. Yi Zhixiang held old Madame Ye's hand and took a notebook from the bedside table. She stuffed a pen into old Madame Ye's hand. "Mom, write this for Brother Tingrui." Old Madame Yi, who could still move her hands, wrote the word "simple" on the notebook with trembling hands. Then her gaze fell on Yi Zhifan's face. Her face was so ferocious that it made Yi Ying's heart beat faster. "I've been busy with Ying Ying going abroad, so I'm not sure about Yi Qian's situation. You and Jixiang instigated my wife to cause trouble at the school. Then something happened to her, and you ran back to the village. Yi Zhifan said casually. He glanced at Yi Zhixiang, whose expression froze, and a hint of mockery flashed in his eyes. Now that something has happened, Zhixiang, you take good care of Mom. I'll come back to visit when I have time. This was something Yi Zhifan had thought carefully before saying. As for Yi Qian, a vicious look flashed across his eyes. He muttered to himself for a while before continuing, let's put Yi Qian's matter aside for now. Let's see which school she gets into first. By the time she got into university, it would be too late. Old Madame Yi, who couldn't speak, was so anxious that more saliva flowed out from the corner of her mouth. Her right hand, which was holding the pen, wobbled as she wrote a word that seemed to be broken. Then, she stared at Yi Zhifan, waiting to see how he would answer her. Yi Zhixiang secretly sighed in relief when she saw that Yi Zhifan didn't come after her. She was really afraid of her second brother now. Yi Zhifan picked up the notebook and looked at it carefully. Then, he smiled faintly and said, Mom, you should ask Sun Yaozu for this kind of thing. He's good at murder and arson. I don't have that kind of ability. Kill Yi Qian. Old Madame Yi was really awe-inspiring. When old Madame Yi heard this, she pounded the bed with both hands. Her cloudy eyes were filled with indignation and anger. She couldn't speak or move. No matter how indignant she was, it was useless. Yi Zhixiang was so angry that she gritted her teeth. She glanced coldly at the silent Yi Ying and sneered, no wonder you're not as good as Yi Qian. When something happened, second brother didn't even dare to take responsibility. He only wanted to push Mom to the wall. Now that Mom is no longer here, second brother is really quick to change his mind. Chapter 1235. Yi Zhixiang. Sun Dongqing's reaction was intense. She couldn't bear to hear that her daughter was worse than Yi Qian. No matter how bad my daughter is, she's still better than your two troublemaking sons. Don't think you can bully me just because you gave birth to two sons. I'm not afraid of you now. Don't think I'm easy to bully. Second sister-in-law, you're so impressive. Why don't you show off in front of Yi Qian? Look at you, Yi Ying was disqualified from the college entrance exam, and you still have the cheek to talk about my two sons. That's right, no matter how bad my two sons are, they didn't embarrass themselves in front of the school students. Yi Ying was so angry that her face turned pale. No matter where she went, people would make fun of her. Even her own aunt was making fun of her. Sun Dongqing saw that her daughter's expression was not right. She turned into a tigress and pounced on Yi Zhixiang. Bitch, your two sons are trash like Sun Yaozu. How dare you talk about my daughter like that? Ha, are you guilty? You're hitting me because you're guilty. Bitch, do you think I'm afraid of you? Yi Zhixiang was not someone to be trifled with. She picked up the foldable chair in the ward and stopped Sun Dongqing, who was unarmed, from moving forward. Yi Zhixiang's smile deepened. If you don't do anything, just wait for Yi Qian to get into a good university. Second sister-in-law, you heard it. Which parent didn't say how good Yi Qian is? Do you think you can send Ying abroad? Do you think you'll be better than Yi Qian once you're abroad? I think even if you send Ying to the best university abroad, she's destined to be worse than Yi Qian. Suddenly, Yi Zhixiang giggled and mocked them even more. I almost forgot. Ying was disqualified from the college entrance exam. It's written on her file. How can the proper universities abroad accept her? Every word she said was like a needle piercing into Yi Ying's heart. While it pierced her heart, it also made the coldness in her eyes thicker. And, if the upper beam is not straight, the lower beam will be crooked. Be careful that the two cousins will become fugitives like uncle when the time comes. You'd better worry about yourself. Don't pass out from anger when you hear that Yi Jian got into a good university. Yi Zhixiang's mouth never had anything nice to say. She would say anything that made people uncomfortable. Yi Zhifan's face darkened. He looked at Yi Zhixiang coldly and said, "You played a big part in making Mom what she is today. Am I wrong?" Yi Zhixiang snorted. She could tell that no matter how close her mother was to her second brother, the cold-hearted second brother would never be close to her. Sun Dongqing was furious because she wasn't wrong. She glared at her sister-in-law who had never given her a good time for more than 10 years. Sun Dongqing said fiercely, "Every dog has its day. Yi Zhixiang, I'll wait for the day when you beg my family." Even now, Sun Dongqing still couldn't accept that Yi Qian was better than Yi Ying. She even comforted her daughter like this after leaving the hospital. Don't listen to Yi Zhixiang's nonsense. Even if Yi Qian takes the college entrance exam, she won't be able to get into a good university. When the time comes, go and give her a good scolding. Don't let her be so brazen. After saying this in the afternoon, she was slapped in the face on the afternoon of the third day. A student from the provincial first high school who lived in the same building went home and told his parents that Yi Qian was the only girl in the province who was admitted to the National University of Science and Technology. He also said that she was not only the top scorer in the province, but also the top scorer in the country. The entire provincial capital was in an uproar. Yi Ying was dumbfounded when she heard this. Chapter 1236. How is that possible? There must be a mistake. How could that wretched girl be the top scorer in science? There must be a problem, old Yi, there must be a problem. Call and check, we need to check her score. Sun Dongqing, who had returned home in the provincial capital, could not accept it. How could a wretched girl, who had lived in her daughter's shadow for a long time and was inferior to her in every aspect, achieve such good results? It's fake, it's fake. It must be fake. National University of Science and Technology, no wonder she rejected the direct recruitment of Hua University and Shi University. It turned out that she wanted to get into the National University of Science and Technology, a top military school in the country that counted military service and had living allowances. Ah ah ah. Yi Ying's angry roar came from the room, followed by a series of clattering sounds. Sun Dongqing, who was throwing a tantrum in the living room, jumped up in shock. The door was locked from the inside, and Sun Dongqing anxiously banged on the door. Ing, don't scare me. It's okay, it's okay. It's fake, it's all fake. Yi Zhifan, who was equally anxious, saw this and pulled his wife away. He shouted angrily, "The score can't be fake, she got into the National University of Science and Technology after so many exams. What's the use of throwing a tantrum at home now? Military school, are we going to be soldiers? Soldiers, we can be soldiers too. If she's a soldier, you can be a soldier too. It's not a big deal." Sun Dongqing was afraid that her only daughter would take things too hard and her knees would go weak. We can be soldiers, we won't be worse than her. Soldiers. Yi Zhifan's eyes narrowed slightly. If they could not find a good school overseas, being a soldier was not a bad way out. Moreover, with his daughter's intelligence, she could also get into the military school in the army. Your mom is right. If you want to join the army, we can sign up in the winter and try to get into the military school based on your results. Yi Zhifan was much calmer and could convince Yi Ying more. Dad is also responsible this time. Come out first, we can talk. The door opened and Yi Ying walked out expressionlessly. Dad, Mom, I don't want to go abroad, I want to be a soldier. Help me find out if I can get into the military school in the army. I'll join the army this year. All right. Yi Jifan nodded. Joining the army was indeed a way out. However, the family of three had forgotten something very important. When Ying was in junior high school, she had gotten a certificate that clearly stated that she had heart disease. According to the physical examination standards for conscripted citizens, patients with heart disease were not eligible for conscription. When Ho Zi, who was in the provincial capital, found out that old Madame Yi had suffered a stroke and had been transferred to the provincial capital hospital for treatment, he also found out that Yi Qian was the top scorer in the national science exam. He called Xia Yiwei, who was no longer as cold to him as before. I heard that Yi Qian got into the military academy and is the top scorer in the national science exam. Sixth brother's foresight was extraordinary. Luckily, sixth brother treats Yi Qian well. He's a little like me. In return, Xia Yiwei smiled coldly. Did he call her whenever something happened? Yi Qian was the top scorer in the National Science Olympiad. Did he still need him to tell him? Sixth brother's surname is Xia, not Ho. Don't flatter yourself. With that, she hung up the phone. It was as if she was tired of talking to him. Ho Zi gripped his phone and smiled bitterly. Once a woman hardened her heart, it was really heartless. Who asked you to think that she will always be your woman? Now that she's not with you, you can continue to shamelessly pursue her. Ho Zi put away his phone and looked determined. He only had Xia Yiwei and he would only pursue her. Chapter 1237. After Xia Yiwei hung up, she immediately called Xia Jinyuan. Listening to the airport announcer's voice from the phone, Xia Yiwei said in a deep voice, "Old Madame Yi has suffered a stroke and is in the hospital. Shouldn't you and Ho Zi stop?" Xia Jinyuan, who was preparing to board the plane, smiled and said, "I stopped a long time ago. You can ask Brother Zi if he stopped. I can't talk to you anymore. Yi Qian and I are preparing to board the plane. You are now." Xia Yiwei's voice came from the phone. Xia Jinyuan's expression was normal as he hung up the phone. He had to admit that the two siblings hung up at a similar speed. Yi Qian, who was walking with a map of China, saw this and frowned slightly. Sister Yiwei didn't say anything. "Why did you hang up?" Yi Qian, who knew her results, was very calm. After the exam, she knew her results and knew that she would have no problem getting into the National University of Science and Technology. When she heard the exact news, she was only stunned for a second. Hard work pays off. She finally took a symbolic step forward. Now that she had calmed down, she held the map of China that she bought at the airport and looked at it from the north to the south with great interest. It's not convenient for me to say anything about her and Brother Zi. I can only hang up. Xia Jinyuan, who didn't want Yi Qian to know too much, calmly changed the topic. The map only shows 9 sections of the sea in the south. The place we are going to isn't on it. Yi Qian didn't ask further when she heard that it was a personal matter. Her slender finger pointed at the blue area on the map and she smiled peacefully. Although I can't see it, I know a little bit. I don't want others to ask me about the latitude and longitude of the place we are going to. Li Jinyan doesn't care about superficial things. He only cares about personal results. Xia Jinyuan held her hand and walked into the cabin together. They found a seat and sat down. If you want to know more, let's go to the reference room tonight. The noon flight would take 2.5 hours to reach the airport. Then, they would need to take a 3-hour car ride to reach the port that led to the base. Then, they would need to take an hour to reach the base by boat. They would only arrive at the base at around 7 in the evening. The sky was blue and the sea was magnificent. A few rubber boats brought the first batch of eliminated soldiers back to the shore. When they were a few meters away from the shore, a Navy soldier wearing a tight black diving suit shouted, "Come down, push the rubber boats ashore." The soldiers sitting on the rubber boats looked sick. They looked sickly and weak. Some of their lips were pale and bleeding. Small wounds on their lips were bleeding from the sun. At first glance, they looked quite scary. Hearing the shouts, a few soldiers gritted their teeth and jumped into the water, ready to push the rubber dinghies. There were a few who were not convinced and directly shouted, "We have already been eliminated, why are we pushing the rubber dinghies? If you want to push, push it yourselves. I'm not doing it." They were eliminated and kicked out of the training camp island without a single chance. Many of the soldiers were still angry. Now that they were asked to push the rubber boats, they took the opportunity to make a fuss. The soldiers who went into the water looked at each other. They pushed the rubber boats with both hands but didn't say anything. "What? You have a problem because we didn't keep you." The Storm Amphibian Frogman Commando who spoke jumped directly from the rubber boat into the salty and bitter seawater. His gaze was as cold as the ripples on the surface of the sea, and his voice was as sharp as a blade. "Children playing house. Let go if you're not satisfied. Not bad, you have guts." Chapter 1238. The commando grinned, his white teeth gleaming under the sunlight. "It's pointless if you don't push me. Take care of yourselves." After that, he plunged into the sea, which reached his waist, and disappeared without a trace in the blink of an eye under the shocked expressions of all the soldiers. "He's gone. He's gone. What should we do?" The few eliminated soldiers who still wanted to resist and get off the boat were all dumbfounded. They jumped off the rubber boat one after another, and two of them even tried to chase after him. Someone pulled them back and said helplessly, "We can't catch up. They're real water ghosts. We can't catch up." The mysterious and dangerous deep-sea diving was a common occurrence for real water ghosts. Sometimes, even without equipment, they could dive 15 meters down in an instant without any problem. When they plunged into the water, the speed at which they swam down in 1 second was equivalent to the speed at which they swam out in 10 seconds. It was impossible for them to catch up. "Seems like there's a wave. Quick, push the rubber boat up. Without a water ghost to guide us, none of us will be able to reach the shore." The waves came as they wished, one after another as if they had calculated the time. For a moment, all of them jumped into the water like dumplings and began to push the rubber boat. At a hidden sentry post on the deserted island, someone was watching everything with binoculars. When he saw the waves coming one after another, and when two soldiers were directly knocked over by the waves, his tightly pursed lips curled into a cold smile. Get the few people whose names start with D to keep an eye on them. Make sure they don't show up until the rubber boat has drifted 100 nautical miles away. Li Jinyan put down the binoculars and said coldly. He stepped down from the sentry post in his military boots. Contact the garrison and ask when the last soldier will arrive. The soldiers whose names started with D were the scouting water ghosts of the Storm Commandos. If you don't see her before the 5:00 tomorrow, tell the garrison directly and ask her to return to where she came from. His voice was as cold as the snow on the top of a snowy mountain that never melted all year round. The commandos behind him did not say anything unnecessary and immediately replied, "Yes." In their hearts, they were thinking, isn't this a bit too much? Didn't they say that she would only arrive at 7:00 at night? It would take another 4 hours to reach them from the base, and there would be big waves tonight. Even if they arrived, they wouldn't have the energy to participate in the training at 5:00 tomorrow. The Navy commander had naturally taken this into consideration as well. His gaze shifted from a female soldier whose skin was as white as snow, to a pearl-like luster. He thought for a moment before smiling and saying, "Yi Qian, your team leader wants you to participate in the training at 5 a.m. tomorrow morning. The training location is about 4 hours away from the encampment. Go get your equipment now and set off immediately." "Yes." Without a word of nonsense, the Marine commander could not help but raise his eyebrows. Xia Jinyuan was expressionless as well. He smiled and said, as expected of the famous Devil King, "Even his training style can produce good gold. You have to abide by the rules of whoever's territory you're in. No one can break the rules, and no one can claim to be special." This was the case for the Storm Amphibious Frogman Commandos and the Snowfield Brigade. Xia Jinyuan, who was watching Yi Qian leave, heard the Navy commander say, "He is indeed the sharp knife of our army. The soldiers trained by him are all like gold and can all become sharp knives. Since the army sent Yi Qian to our naval base, as long as she is not afraid of hardship and fatigue, we will definitely not let her down. When the time comes, we will be waiting for you to review the results." The Major General believes in the Devil King's ability. "Before I came, the Major General even smiled and said that if there was a chance, he would like our detachment to compete with the Devil King's commandos. How could his little fox be afraid of hardship and fatigue?" Looking at her fearless back, he was already looking forward to the results review before school started. Chapter 1239. The station was close to the sea, and the sound of the waves could be heard from the windows of the Navy commander's office. The sound of the waves crashing against the sea gave off an inexplicable sense of excitement. It was 7:30 p.m., and there were still a few rays of golden sunset at the edge of the sea. The sand by the sea was dyed golden yellow, and the ground was covered with fragments of gold. Listening to the voice of his subordinate outside, the Navy commander's gaze dimmed a little. He laughed heartily and answered Xia Jinyuan, "That's fine. It'll definitely be interesting if you two teams have a match." Thinking it was feasible, the Navy commander said with interest, "When Li Jinyan's recruit training is over, I'll talk to him and see if we can have a match. Next year, there will be a match between our army and a special force of the U.S. military. If we conduct our own training in advance." The Navy commander's hearty voice gradually lowered, and he looked serious. He was obviously considering the Major General's proposal. Does the Major General have any plans or arrangements? Has he proposed to the military? A match between two special forces was not a trivial matter. It required a report and an application, and then it would be approved according to the actual situation. It could only be carried out when the highest-ranking officers of the two armies voted and the military issued the approval. The Major General is also very interested. August to October is the best time for autumn. If you're interested, the Major General can draft a report first. Xia Jinyuan listened to the Navy commander's words with a smile on his handsome face. He said coldly, "As you said, there will be a match between our army and the U.S. military next year. The U.S. military has always been strong. Since our army is going abroad to meet the enemy, we can't embarrass our country." Yi Qian had already left with the soldiers arranged by the Navy. They would leave in 10 minutes after receiving their equipment. Xia Jinyuan, who could no longer hear her voice, said calmly, "If you're interested, we can do our best to arrange a match before October." The whistle of gathering by the seaside passed into the office through the open window. After a day of training, the Navy quickly gathered and organized, standing in a horizontal and vertical line square formation at the speed of the sea rain passing through the storm. They neatly and orderly reported their numbers, startling the seabirds that landed on the reef and flapping their wings to fly to the sea. His gaze fell on the naval commander outside the window. His expression was solemn. After a while, he replied, "You're right. If you go, you can't lose face for the country. Since it's possible that you and Li Jinyan will be leading the expedition, you should cultivate a tacit understanding. The Major General has the same thoughts as you, so he wants to have a match before October and wait until the end of the year to have mutual training. Xia Jinyuan's voice also gradually lowered. He mentioned that a certain war that ended in the spring and summer of this year was directly caused by a high-tech war led by the United States at the end of the 20th century. Although the Air Force is the main force in this war, the U.S. Army has also played a critical role in this war. Although the Air Force is the main force in this war, the U.S. Army has also played a very important role. Destruction, assassination, several ethnic leaders of the Southern Alliance were killed. At the same time, the electricity and communications of the entire Southern Alliance were cut off, and they quickly set up a communication base with the Air Force base. It's not hard to see the strength of the Americans from this. Let's go over there and learn from them. Chapter 1240. The topic of strong countries, big countries, and weak countries always seemed a little helpless, but they couldn't avoid it because of helplessness. They had to pay attention to it and solve it. The Navy commander patted the young major's shoulder gently, and there was a hint of relief in his solemn expression. With you guys, I believe that all problems won't become a problem. By the way, have you learned about the female soldier you sent? The topic changed very quickly, and the result was already known. They just sighed and used it as a topic to talk about. Xia Jinyuan smiled faintly. Yes, I have. She's a very outstanding female soldier. However, now that she's training under the Devil King, he still has to judge whether she's outstanding or not. I can only say that Yi Qian is a very outstanding female soldier in our team. The Navy commander's smile deepened when he didn't immediately confirm and only expressed his opinion. Don't look at how polite you are. In fact, you're the same as the Devil King. You definitely won't easily say that a soldier is outstanding because your definition of outstanding is quite high. Soldiers with good qualifications are only above not bad, and are still a distance away from outstanding. I'm sorry for making a fool of myself. Xia Jinyuan didn't deny or confirm. He maintained a smile and walked out of the office with the Navy commander. Night fell, and the waves reached the sky. Several patrol ships docked at the port of the station shook slightly with the waves. A few Navy sentries stood like white poplars with steel guns in their hands, guarding the borders of the motherland with cold eyes. Xia Jinyuan, who was looking at the sea, heard the sound of the waves. His dark eyes couldn't help but narrow slightly. What kind of ship would send her across such big waves? Just as he was thinking, a Navy lieutenant colonel walked over and saluted the Navy commander. He handed over a folder in his hand. The Ocean Europe has docked at the port and is awaiting orders to depart. Good. The Navy commander took the folder and signed his name on a document for the departure of the special battleship. He said, "The new recruit is an army soldier. Let the soldiers on the ship take care of her. The waves are a little big, so she might get seasick. Prepare some seasick pills for her first." Xia Jinyuan stood 3 steps away and looked away. He did not look at the document signed by the Navy commander. As the lieutenant colonel left, the commander smiled and said, "Yi Qian will depart in a light combat boat in 5 minutes. Li Jinyan will report his safety when he arrives." The light special warship was an indispensable warship in the Navy. It could cooperate with the coastal patrol boats and rigid inflatable boats. Once the Navy found something abnormal on the sea, it could set off from the forward base and carry out a surgical strike on the target. Yi Qian set off in a light battleship. With the draft of the battleship, he could completely ignore the waves. The light battleships could ignore the waves, but the inflatable dinghies couldn't. The soldiers sitting on the dinghies looked at the vast sea and panicked. "Rest first and save up your energy. We'll rotate shifts every 3 hours. Check the ropes. Don't let the waves separate our 3 rubber boats. You guys in front, check the ropes. Arrange for the personnel to rotate shifts every 3 hours. It's only 8:00 at night. Don't be in a hurry to go to bed. Bring a diving light and see if you can find something to eat. Otherwise, everyone will go to bed hungry tonight. They had fished in the sea empty-handed during the day and had no harvest. They could only go to the sea at night to take a look. Chapter 1241. He watched as a few soldiers put on diving suits and jumped off the rubber boat. Less than 2 nautical miles away from them, 3 water ghosts quietly emerged from the sea and recorded the names of the first few soldiers. The first batch of elimination did not mean that they had to pack up and return to their original units. The selection of the Demon King never followed the normal process. It had always been the Demon King style to find potential soldiers from the eliminated soldiers. The soldiers selected from various units had been screened in their original units. Their individual comprehensive ability was not bad, but the first batch was eliminated. It was very likely that they did not adapt to the training method, which was why they were a hindrance. Only by carefully observing their coping ability, survival ability, and reaction speed could the final judgment be made. It was like panning for gold in the sand. One needed to be careful. The waves on the sea rose and fell, and the rubber boat went up and down. The soldiers who took turns to stand guard had starlight above their heads. Their eyes were fixed on the boat without blinking. Once they noticed something, they could immediately inform all their comrades. The light special battleship was slightly less bumpy due to the water. Yi Qian, who had changed into a Navy training suit, ate a simple canned meal with the soldiers on the boat and wobbled all the way to the reef island. Yi Qian did not get seasick. She was able to catch up on sleep during the bumpy ride. Her situation was unexpectedly good. The light special battleship docked 15 minutes earlier than expected. Li Jinyan, who was standing by the sea and waiting, suddenly turned around and said to his teammate named Big Whale, "Observe her first. Then take her to a single tent to rest. If necessary, test her in the water first. Let me know what's going on." "That's not very nice. She's a female soldier after all. How can you give her a show of strength?" Big Whale was a little surprised. He softly advised, "Let's be gentle first. The people sent by the army may have some status." Li Jinyan twitched the corner of his mouth and smiled. "No status. I've seen the information. Her mother was a martyr." He decided that he would not change his mind. Looking at the light special battleship that had stopped, Li Jinyan patted Big Whale's shoulder and left with a cold expression. Even Xia Jinyuan thought that the female soldier was not bad. She should not be too bad. It was better to let Big Whale test the water first and see if it was fake. The daughter of a martyr. How do you want me to test her? There aren't many good swimmers in the army, right? The light battleship will stop about 30 meters away from us. Can she swim 30 meters with a backpack? If I go over and scare her into choking on water? Demon King, be careful that the commander will punish you. Big Whale was a little worried. He was not familiar with the new female soldier and did not know how good she was in the water. If he accidentally injured her or let her be swept away by the sea, that would be no laughing matter. Li Jinyan could tell that his team member was treating the new female soldier as an elite soldier. He reminded him calmly, "She's a reserve special forces soldier." It meant, don't look down on others. The whale's expression suddenly turned serious as he nodded. "He has some background, but I'm afraid that something might happen. We'll play it by ear. I'll leave it to you." Li Jinyan didn't stay any longer and walked towards the camp for the night. "Under the water or on the water?" The whale's excited voice came from behind him. Li Jinyan knew that he was still willing to test the waters. Walking under the starry sky, Li Jinyan made a hand gesture, and the whale took off his training uniform. It was as if he had become invisible. Under the starlight, they could only see a vigorous figure plunging into the water. Let's give it a try underwater. I haven't fought with a female special forces soldier before. This is interesting. Chapter 1242. Yi Jian, who was about to get off the ship, said thank you to the Navy Lieutenant Colonel who was sending her off. Then, she grabbed the waterproof backpack that was issued by the Navy Equipment Department and went into the water directly from the aft deck of the light battleship. Do you see the flashing red laser on the reef? Someone is already there to pick you up. Just swim over. The Navy Lieutenant Colonel who connected to the reef island squatted down and smiled at the female soldier whose face was only the size of a palm and whose eyes were brighter than the stars. It's less than 30 meters away. Just swim over. The light special battleship was different from the air cushion landing craft. It couldn't dock on a reef island without a port. It could only dock on the surface of the sea. When Yi Jian came down, she was hit by a wave and fell forward. With her backpack on her back, she could only wave and dive into the sea without saying goodbye. She swam towards the reef island that was faintly visible in the distance. Compared to the nimbleness of the water ghost, Yi Jian's swimming speed was neither fast nor slow. After all, she had also trained by the sea for a month. It was just that her training wasn't as systematic as water ghosts. The land tigers were the Snowfield Brigade, and the sea dragons were the Storm Amphibious Frogman Assault Team. As a reserve member of the Snowfield Brigade, Yi Qian entered the range of the sea dragons. She was warned by Xia Jinyuan to stay alert as soon as she entered the water, in case there was a special welcome ceremony. When a whale entered the sea, it was like a dragon returning to the sea. Every day, he would have sandbags tied to his feet for 5 kilometers of cross-country training. Twice a week, he would swim for 5 kilometers. His feet were very strong in breaking water. With just a few swings of his tail, he could swim 200 meters at a speed that was beyond imagination. When Yi Qian surfaced from the water, the light special battleship had already left. Their destination wasn't the reef island, but the reef island that they needed to pass by Li Jinyan's training ground. As the light special battleship left, Yi Qian, who was completely wet, swam towards the shore with her backpack. 4 years of training had allowed Yi Qian to remain calm even when facing the unpredictable sea alone. Listening to the sound of the waves, she paddled with both hands and maintained a moderate speed. Using the momentum of the waves, she relaxed her body and swam over. After swimming for about 5 meters, Yi Qian's calm gaze suddenly sharpened. He swept his gaze across the surface of the sea about 3 meters to his left. He had been targeted by a water ghost. Fighting in the water was her weakness, and it would be troublesome if she was targeted. However, as Captain Xia said, it suited Li Jinyan's style very well. Yi Qian's gaze landed on the big whale as soon as he popped his head out of the water. He was a little surprised. With his diving goggles on, he narrowed his eyes and revealed a deep smile. She was so sharp. He had only just emerged from the water to observe her, but she had already discovered him. He really wanted to applaud her for being so sharp. However, just being sharp wasn't enough. It depended on her underwater reflexes. Compared to on land, the requirements for underwater reflexes were several times higher. The ancient Roman statesman Cicero said, "Whoever controls the sea can control the world." From this sentence, one could see the importance of a country's control over the sea. From this, one could understand how strict the physical fitness of the members of the Frogman Commando team was. The big whale was a qualified water ghost who had undergone strict and systematic training. Yi Qian, as an all-round special forces soldier in the army, had already lost the upper hand in terms of geographical advantage against the big whale in the water. However, this wasn't a reason for Yi Qian to back down. She opened her inflatable backpack as fast as she could, pulled out her combat dagger, and faced the water ghost, who had grabbed her ankle head-on. Chapter 1243. Water and Earth were completely different existences. Although the former could be felt right beside you, it would never give you the sense of security that Earth gave you. Once water surrounded you from all directions, a fatal suffocation would follow. Humanity's deepest fear of nature would also follow. Yi Qian, who was holding an underwater combat dagger, twisted his body. The first thing he did was to surface and take a deep breath. Then, he attacked the water demon, who was trying to lock his legs again. With the help of the buoyancy of the water, Yi Qian twisted her legs and spun 3 times like a spinning top. She used too much force and a small whirlpool was formed in the sea water because of her body. Even when his lower limbs were locked, he could still use the strength of his lower limbs to rotate his entire body. This move surprised the whale. Didn't they say that female soldiers were from the army? How did she know the essentials of underwater combat? Fortunately, underwater communication relied on sign language. Otherwise, the whale might have directly asked Yi Qian if he had transferred from the navy to the army. Yi Qian did not give the whale much time to think. When his right leg was free, he raised his leg and kicked his opponent's shoulder with the ferocity of a special forces soldier. The results of his endurance running and weight-bearing training showed. Although the water was buoyant, Yi Qian's legs were full of strength. His kick landed on the whale's shoulder bone, causing the whale to lean back 2 steps. Using brute force in underwater combat would only increase the speed of exhaustion. The whale was shocked. Yi Qian, who had broken free, knew that fighting on land was not going to work. Although he had kicked the water demon in the shoulder, he had also used up a lot of energy. The change in the body's stress points was the biggest obstacle in underwater combat. Without a support point, the water would not only create buoyancy and pressure on the human body, but it would also affect the force exerted by each movement. The lethality of the movements would drop to a frightening level. Just like just now, if they were fighting on land, her kick would definitely have sent the water demon flying. It would not have only made him lean back 2 steps. He had to think of a way. Yi Qian, who had broken free twice in a row, decided not to continue fighting. His face was tense as he quickly swam towards the shore. The whale saw this and laughed in its heart. The female soldier was fast, but she was still far behind them. In the water, it was the water demon's world. In the army, it was always slightly inferior. Behind him, Yi Qian, who was swimming as fast as he could, swam forward less than 2 meters before he realized that he had made a serious and low-level mistake. Wasn't she trying to compete with the water demon in terms of swimming speed? Yi Qian, who had always been rational, realized that she had made a mistake. She quickly came up with a countermeasure. Since she couldn't escape, she could only strike first. When fighting underwater, most of the time, the body would be in a supine or prone position. When fighting with a water ghost that was familiar with underwater combat, the first reason was to quickly change the body's state. Then, how could he change the body's state and find the best point to withstand the force? Yi Qian opened his inflatable backpack and dove into the water, temporarily hiding from the water demon's pursuit. He had no advantage in the water. If he wanted to escape, he needed to fight and retreat quickly. Yi Qian, who was hiding and thinking, started playing hide-and-seek with the whale. The other party did not have any diving equipment. Like him, he could not stay underwater for too long. Also, he had used the lock move just now, which meant that the essentials of underwater combat included a lock. Chapter 1244. This way, Yi Qian could extend to hug Anne. Starting from the whale's lock technique, Yi Qian's lips curled into a smile as he grasped another technique, grab. Hug the water ghost from behind, lock the opponent, and then grab the attack. On land, there were a series of complicated and changeable moves such as striking, hitting, kicking, locking, and so on. Since he couldn't get hurt in the water, the underwater moves couldn't be complicated. They had to be simple. Once complicated, the consumption of his physical strength would only be greater. Fast, accurate, and ruthless reaction, coupled with the technical moves of grabbing, hugging, stabbing, slashing, hacking, and locking. Yi Qian narrowed his eyes and revealed a faint, bloodthirsty smile in the darkness. Since Demon King Li's way of welcoming her was so unique, she would give it a try. In a fight like this, even if she lost, she would lose fair and square. On the other side, the whale was a little panicked at first. The female soldier had suddenly disappeared from the surface of the sea, and he was only wearing a diving suit without any other equipment. If the waves really swept the female soldier away, he would really be a sinner. After searching for about 4 minutes, the whale, who had emerged from the water, suddenly saw a human head about 3 meters away from him. Grabbing Yi Qian's unbuttoned backpack, he raised his eyebrows. "Oh, she's swimming towards me. Don't tell me she's afraid." That's why there was one bad thing about female soldiers. Sometimes, they were afraid of water and the dark. He had tried it just now, thinking that she would be interesting, but in the end, she was still as boring as before. In an instant, the whale's interest was greatly reduced. Since she was in the army, she should just stay in the army. Carry your backpack properly. Don't send a wave a few hundred meters away. We'll have to send more people. Before he could say the words, "save you," he saw only the undulating waves on the surface of the sea, and no one was there anymore. Oh no! The whale, who suddenly felt a sense of danger, hurriedly threw his backpack aside and dove into the water like a fish. His reaction was fast enough, but he was still one step slower than Yi Qian, who had a plan in mind. His neck was suddenly locked, and the combat dagger, which was still in its scabbard, stabbed towards his spine. The great whale raised his hand and elbowed Yi Qian's waist. Then, he grabbed Yi Qian's arm with one hand and quickly adjusted his balance in the water with his feet. As soon as Yi Qian saw him retaliate, he knew he was no match for him. When he tried to grab his neck, Yi Qian adjusted his balance and reached out to grab Water Ghost's face. "If I can't win, then I'll leave a mark." In the cold seawater, the whale felt cold sweat dripping down its back. In just 4 or 5 minutes, she had switched from simply kicking to hugging, grabbing, slashing, and stabbing. He had only managed to escape after a few consecutive counterattacks by relying on the water demon's advantage. Even so, her lumbar spine was still blocked by her unsheathed combat dagger. Sensing Yi Qian's murderous aura, the whale swam back about a meter and said loudly, "Stop, stop, stop. We can go ashore now. Does that mean we don't have to fight anymore?" Yi Qian hugged her backpack tightly. Her voice was as cold as ice as she said in a deep voice, "I didn't lose just now, did I?" The whale wiped the seawater off its face and chuckled. It stretched out its clenched fingers and said with a smile, "No, no. I've offended you on our first meeting. Please forgive me. I'm the great whale. The Demon King sent me to bring you ashore." How was that a loss? Even he was scared witless. Chapter 1245. "Hello, I'm Yi Qian." Yi Qian smiled and extended his hand. After a brief introduction, he fastened his backpack and swam towards the shore. It had only been 10 minutes of combat, but his stamina was depleted as if he had run for hours. Even his breathing was a little unstable. On the other hand, the frogman codenamed Big Whale beside him was breathing steadily. Although he had won twice, he would definitely lose in a long battle. Yi Qian narrowed his eyes, but his eyes were full of interest. Captain Xia was right. He could learn a lot by following Demon King Li. Even though it had been less than 2 months, he had benefited greatly. When he reached the shore, the salty sea breeze blew. Yi Qian, who was completely soaked, did not feel cold. Instead, he felt quite comfortable. The feeling of stepping on solid ground and no longer being surrounded by pervasive water was great. Big Whale, who habitually came ashore, pointed at the dark reef in front of them and smiled. The camp is in front. The conditions are not very good. Please excuse us when you see them later. He knew how to be polite. Was it because she was a female soldier? Would you say something like that when you see other recruits? Yi Qian asked with a smile. His military boots stepped on the soft sand as if he was walking on clouds. Or is it because I'm a female soldier? She had a murderous aura, her movements were murderous, and she could react quickly in the water. She could catch the enemy off guard. Such a female soldier, even if she was a female soldier, was still a character. Big Whale bent down and picked up the training uniform he had taken off before entering the water. He laughed and said, "No, no. You are a female soldier, but you are definitely not an ordinary female soldier. I've seen it for myself just now. Not an ordinary female soldier." Li Jinyan narrowed his eyes and looked at Big Whale, who had returned to report to him. There was a hint of darkness in his cold voice. Other than her quick reaction, what else is different about her? The male soldiers did not live in tents. Even Li Jinyan lived in a simple shed built with plants growing on the reef island. When the solar lights were turned on, it was as bright as day inside. The shirtless whale sat on a rock. His tanned face looked serious as he answered, "She has the same murderous aura as us. I'm sure she must have carried out a secret mission." Not only was her reaction fast, but when I sent her to the tent, I asked her how she thought of hugging my neck from behind. Guess what she said? He wanted to keep Li Jinyan in suspense, but to his surprise, Li Jinyan gently raised his cold eyes. The whale rubbed his nose awkwardly and quickly answered, "She said that it was because I've locked her legs tightly." She also thought about the problem of underwater strength. She thought that the biggest difference between fighting in the water and fighting on land was that it was mainly simple. She could use hugging to lock her legs, and after hugging her, she still had to grab her. I guess that's the basic point of underwater fighting. He had only locked her legs, but she had thought of many things at once, and she had even hit the nail on the head. Smart. The expressionless Li Jinyan raised his eyebrows slightly. After a while, he said faintly, "No wonder the army insisted on sending her here. I think this female soldier is interesting. Didn't you say that she's not even 19 years old? Why do I feel like she has a few years of experience in the army?" Big Whale finally asked the biggest question he had after the fight with Yi Qian. She might have carried out a life-or-death mission. Why does it sound a little? Big Whale deliberated for a while before saying the last word softly, "That's ridiculous." Li Jinyan, who had seen Yi Qian's personal information, did not know what kind of life-or-death mission she had carried out, but with her 4 years of Special Forces training, it was not ridiculous at all. Chapter 1246. After a moment of silence, Li Jinyan, who had been judging Yi Qian in his heart, asked again, "Did she have any expression after reading the training plan tomorrow?" The great whale thought for a moment and shook his head. No expression. She only replied, "Got it." Other than that, she didn't say anything else. Yi Qian, who had undergone strict training, had long been accustomed to military orders are as important as mountains. Even if she had any objections to the training plan, she would not change it at all. At this point, Li Jinyan's cold handsome face finally showed a hint of a smile, like a gorgeous rosy cloud floating across the top of a snowy mountain. It was so beautiful that it actually gave birth to a gorgeous color. Fortunately, the great whale did not look up. Instead, he lowered his head and guessed Yi Qian's origin. The rosy smile on Li Jinyan's face was like a snowy wind blowing past. In less than a second, it returned to its original expression, no longer showing any trace of it. Yi Qian, who was in the middle of their discussion, had already changed her clothes. She zipped up the tent and looked up at the night sky, where she could touch the bright stars just by reaching out her hand. She looked, and after a while, she closed her eyes. When she opened her eyes again, it was already 5:00 in the morning. There was no whistle, no call sign, and she had to wake up on her own. Yi Qian, who had arrived 10 minutes earlier, did not appear immediately. She hid behind the reef and observed in the faint light. Last night, the great whale's meaningful gaze before he left made her feel that the morning assembly would not be too simple. Someone stood on the beach with his hands behind his back. Standing in the faint light, his figure was vague and mysterious. He was very tall, at least 185 meters. His limbs were slender and well-proportioned. He stood motionless, as if he had been standing there for thousands of years. What surprised Yi Qian was the aura emanating from his body. It was different from Xia Jinyuan's mountain-like aura, which made her feel at ease at first sight. His aura was turbulent and cold, as if a snowy mountain was about to collapse. It was a powerful aura that could devour everything in its path. Yi Qian immediately averted his gaze to avoid being discovered by Li Jinyan. His intuition told Yi Qian that the figure standing in front of him must be Li Jinyan. 3 water ghosts swept across the beach like ghosts. They hugged the nameless tree with their hands and climbed up the tree in the blink of an eye without the help of any climbing tools. The sound of seagulls could be heard from the trees. It was a signal for each other. Yi Qian perked up. As expected, the assembly in the morning would not go smoothly. At 5:07, 5 silhouettes jogged out from the left side. The line was neat and tidy, and there were even chants of 1, 2, 1. They looked quite neat and energetic. Li Jinyan's gaze suddenly darkened. He raised his hand slightly, and several figures suddenly rushed out from all directions. They piled on top of a few people at lightning speed. Are you kidding me? A sneak attack so early in the morning. Do you still want to train? Is it interesting? Is it interesting? 2 people in front were still able to resist. They said a few words before their mouths were covered. The other 3 Navy soldiers were directly pressed down on the beach. A murderous roar came from above them. Shut up, all of you. Otherwise, you'll eat a mouthful of sand. Yi Qian, who had witnessed everything, sighed softly. Suddenly, his hair stood on end. He rolled forward twice in a row to avoid the sneak attack from the people on the reef. The water ghost leaped down from the reef and let out a small cry of surprise, expressing all sorts of meanings. Chapter 1247. First, what a fast reaction speed. Second, the figure was unfamiliar. Third, female soldier. Fourth, female soldier from the army. The water ghost smiled when he sensed a female soldier hiding in the dark. The Demon King said that you can watch from the sidelines for the time being. There's no need for you to participate. With that, he disappeared from Yi Qian's sight with one hand on the reef. Yi Qian, who was kneeling on the ground with one hand on the beach, pursed his lips tightly. He had only glanced at him for a moment, and he had noticed it in less than a second. There were still 4 minutes before the assembly at 5:00. The first batch of 24 Navy soldiers was treated to an early morning appetizer by a group of water ghosts. One by one, they were cleaned up neatly. Within 10 minutes, all 24 soldiers were piled on top of each other. One by one, they crawled up with their heads covered in dust, puffed out their chests, and gathered quickly. Yi Qian had already blended in and was standing at the very end of the first row. She was a new recruit, so there was no mistake in standing there. Li Jinyan's gaze slid past her face. His icy cold voice pierced through the sea breeze and reached Yi Jian's ears clearly. What are you talking about? Warm-up exercise is over. Let's start the formal training. He really didn't have any superfluous words. He didn't even think about introducing Yi Qian. He pointed at the equipment 3 meters away. Equipment, 2 points. They only had 2 minutes to change their equipment. After a month of hellish elimination training, the remaining 24 soldiers rushed over without panting. They began to change their equipment, and put on their shoes. The shoes weren't ordinary shoes. They were specially made for frogmen with iron sand added to their feet. Put the shoes on. A water ghost wearing a training uniform reminded them and retreated to the side. He stared at the stopwatch, ready to shout for them to stop at any time. Yi Qian put the shoes on and realized that there was something wrong with the shoes. He tied the laces and lifted one foot to test the weight. One shoe was about 2 kilograms. 2 shoes weighed 4 kilograms. Wearing a pair of shoes that weighed 4 kilograms and had to run 5 kilometers around the reef island cross-country. The cruelty of the frogman training was evident. The situation is not bad. For the time being, his speed seems to be on par with the male soldiers. However, in terms of endurance, I'm afraid that he is slightly better. The water ghost, who had been observing along the way, reported the situation to Li Jinyan. Most of the time, his gaze was on Yi Qian. The frequency of his breathing is maintained well. There's not much sluggishness in his knees when he bends and raises his feet. As a soldier who was suddenly parachuted in, and a female soldier at that, Yi Qian did not undergo the first few basic PST screening tests for the Storm Commandos. Naturally, she became the focus of observation. Li Jinyan's understanding of Yi Qian came from the army's written information. To him, this information was only about her personal performance in the army. No matter how outstanding her performance was, it didn't mean that she would be outstanding in the Frogman unit. Even after listening to the Great Whale's report last night, Li Jinyan still maintained his original attitude. He had to go through training before he could confirm whether Yi Qian was qualified and whether he could stay. Demon King, there's news from Big Eel. 3 soldiers can return to the selection competition. A soldier wearing a Navy uniform walked over and saluted with a smile. Big Eel and the others have brought them back. However, the rubber dinghy drifted a little too far away. They need to be brought back by the patrol boat. The main thing is that they have to bring back Big Eel and the others, who are fully equipped. Otherwise, it will take them a day to swim back. Chapter 1248. Li Jinyan looked at his watch and said to the comrade who reported the situation to him, check her physical condition at the port first. Send her back to the reef island before 8:00 tonight. Okay, I'll contact Big Eel right away. The comrade with the code name Big Shark stood on his tiptoes and glanced at the folder in Li Jinyan's hand. He asked with a smile, last night, Big Whale came back and told me that the female soldier from the army has some skills. How do you plan to train her? Female soldier. Didn't our team say that we don't recruit female soldiers? Why did the commander agree? Did they sign a life and death contract? Our team has been established for less than 2 years. Demon King, you have to take it easy. He was afraid that he would be too ruthless and accidentally kill her. After all, everyone knew that female soldiers had weaker resistance to pressure than male soldiers. Their body and bone endurance were also worse than male soldiers. Especially in deep diving areas that were more than 100 meters deep, the difference between the psychological quality of men and women was even more obvious. Female soldiers often had huge psychological pressure due to the special underwater environmental factors. Their emotions would become unstable, and once they panicked, serious diving accidents would occur. It wasn't that such a thing hadn't happened before. It was precisely because there were real cases around that the Great Mermaid was worried. Li Jinyan simply handed the folder to his comrade so that he would not have cramps. After the morning training, take her for a checkup to see if there are any problems with the ventilation function of the eustachian tube. Also, check her tolerance and adaptability to hypoxia and high C02. After the morning training, Big Shark did not refuse. He took the folder and looked at it. As he spoke, he lowered his head and opened the folder. His face immediately showed surprise. Wow, this resume is beautiful. She started training in the second year of junior high. She still played Special Forces training. When I was in the second year of junior high, I was still thinking about how to climb a tree and dig out a bird's nest. Huh? Why didn't it say who trained her? How could she do Special Forces training without the guidance of an expert? Went abroad to participate in the Mathematical Olympiad, individual gold medal. Wow, high IQ. Familiar with all kinds of guns and ammunition, blindfolded and reassembled all kinds of guns, sniper background. Big Shark's eyes widened as he read. When he reached the last paragraph, he closed the folder and stuffed it back into Li Jinyan's hands. He pretended to wipe his cold sweat and said with lingering fear, "What a scary resume." What was even more frightening was that he was the nation's top science scholar. After all this time, she was still a student. No wonder you didn't want to show it to us. Just looking at it makes me feel weak. She didn't study for the first year of high school and went straight to training. Plains, snowy mountains, deserts, oceans, jungles. Oh my God, there wasn't a place that she hadn't been to. She had walked further than him. How valiant and strong this female soldier must be. Could it be that her gender was female, and her height and appearance were both male? Looking at such a frightening resume, it was not impossible. Somehow, the Big Mermaid was a bit worried. Female soldiers who look like men would easily forget her real gender. What if they forgot her gender one day and took off their clothes in front of her? Wouldn't that be too awkward? After thinking about it, he wiped his face and said, "It seems that the army is focusing on grooming her, which is why they sent her to you. Demon King, we can't serve such a person in our team." It was obvious that the army wanted to train Yi Qian, but what the army wanted to do had nothing to do with Li Jinyan. He only knew that she could only listen to the Navy's arrangements. Chapter 1249. Her CV is beautiful, but that's only because of her performance in the army. Now that she's in the Frogman unit, no matter how complicated her previous experience is, she'll have to start all over again. Li Jinyan looked at the time again. He turned on his earpiece and took over the Water Ghost's communicator. "How's the situation, Big Shrimp?" After the electromagnetic buzzing sound came from the earpiece, a rough voice said, "She's maintained her original speed. Her breathing rate is normal. She doesn't feel any sluggishness when she raises her feet. Demon King, why didn't you tell me that Yi Qian is quite beautiful? We met face to face a minute ago. I was dazzled. She's even more gorgeous than a coral reef." It was a characteristic of the Water Ghosts to be able to describe a person's beauty with the colorful color of a coral reef. Li Jinyan had never cared about whether a woman was beautiful or not. Before the army sent the information over, there wasn't even a picture. When they gathered, it was still dark, so he couldn't see what she looked like. He only felt that she was too slender and didn't match the experience on her CV. Keep a close eye on her. We'll see if she's good or bad today. If she doesn't succeed, send her back to the base tonight. It was still the same sentence. The good ones should stay, and the bad ones should leave. They should stay in their original units and be honest soldiers. Don't even think about joining the Frogman assault team. Li Jinyan's requirements for selecting his teammates were absolutely harsh. He wasn't deliberately making things difficult for them. He was being responsible for the responsibility on his shoulders. It was also being responsible for the lives of his teammates. He didn't want to see any sacrifices. Even if he knew that sacrifices were inevitable, he would do his best to prevent his comrades from being sacrificed so that they could continue to serve their country in the future. He also didn't want to see anyone take advantage of the situation. That was blasphemy to the country, disrespect to the army, and contempt for life. Yi Qian knew that she was being watched closely by the water ghosts. Wearing the special shoes filled with iron sand wasn't a difficult task for her. From the first day of sniper training, she had a metal ball hanging from her hands and sandbags tied to her legs. In the end, she had to run back and forth around the training ground of Fujian Town's recruit camp. She had to stand still under the scorching sun, heavy rain, and snow for 4 hours while holding a sniper rifle. However, the feeling of jogging with sandbags tied to his feet was different from jogging with the special shoes. The biggest difference was that the soles of the special shoes were very hard. Running around the reef was either sand or stone. When lifting one's feet, one had to exert a lot of strength, and it consumed a lot of energy. After running for about 40 minutes or so, the distance between the soldiers and the distance between them. The distance between them and the last soldier. Da Xia, who was in charge of keeping a close watch, touched his chin thoughtfully. He contacted Li Jinyan, who had never been interrupted. Demon King, is that female soldier hiding her true strength? 40 minutes later, she still maintained the same distance between them. Now, other than her breathing becoming rapid, nothing else has changed. 5 years of training can't be fake. She has the ability that you can see. Li Jinyan and a few other platoons were preparing a meal. There was only seafood around the island, and the meal they prepared was a seafood feast. According to the price outside, a meal would cost at least 2,000 RMB. He used a combat dagger to slice a fatty fish into thin slices and placed them on top of a large shell. The raw snail meat was placed on top of the shell. When the 24 Navy soldiers and Yi Qian returned, they would be able to serve the seafood feast. In order to train their will to survive and adapt to the pace of the frogmen's training and life, there was no cooked food on the island other than drinking water. There wasn't even a biscuit. They had to rely on themselves. As for starting a fire, that was even more impossible. Chapter 1250. The training of the Storm Commandos was the same as the training of the Snowfield Brigade. It was top secret from its formation to its establishment. Even this batch of Navy soldiers only knew that they would become frogmen and that they would be trained under Li Jinyan, who was known as the Demon King in the Navy. They did not know that once they stood out, they would become the sharp knife of the Navy. Our country's military power had always been discreet and would not easily reveal its strength. Especially after the Southern Alliance War this year, we once again learned of the military power of the Western countries. Our country did not dare to let down our guard. The Western countries had the SEALs, so our country needed the Storm Commandos. The Western countries had the Alpha Special Warfare Special Forces, so our country had the Snowfield Brigade. How many other unknown special forces did the Western countries have? Our country also had unknown special forces. Everything was done in secret. Even if it was just a selection, it was done in secret. For example, the Storm Commandos had 3 meals a day made from local ingredients. When they left, they cleaned up quickly and did not leave any traces. Before they left the reef island, they wouldn't be able to do anything big like starting a fire. Time ticked by, and a red sun slowly rose from the horizon. Its radiance illuminated the entire surface of the sea, and the blue waves connected to the sky. White waves chased after the clouds. This was the sea region of our country. Just like the mainland, it also needed to be protected and could not be invaded by other countries. The morning breeze blew across the surface of the sea. Before the first wave subsided, the waves kept crashing against the black reef that had stood there for God knows how many years. At the end of the reef, a figure jogged over. With tenacity, she gradually appeared in front of the water ghosts who were preparing breakfast. The water ghost who was on sentry duty at the front softly exclaimed. He pressed on his earpiece and quickly reported, "There's an unexpected situation. Demon King, the female soldier who came last night, was first on the first day without saying a word." As soon as he finished speaking, Prawn, who had been secretly observing, said excitedly through the earpiece, "Demon King, did you see the female soldier over there? Amazing. She left the male soldiers a few hundred meters behind in an instant. 5,000 meters with 4 kilograms of weight on her feet and 50 minutes. She only used 5 minutes to catch up with the male soldier running at the front. She used another 5 minutes to completely overtake all the male soldiers. Demon King, this female soldier is not only beautiful, but her skills are also beautiful." Li Jinyan, who was slicing sashimi, paused. He immediately looked forward. His cold expression changed slightly. A hint of surprise flashed across his cold black eyes. She was 10 minutes earlier than he had expected. She was only 15 minutes slower than the water ghost's training speed. Yi Jian's training speed was only 15 minutes slower than the water ghost's. One should know that before this, Yi Jian was an army soldier. All her training and equipment were related to the army. She had nothing to do with the navy at all. Moreover, the water ghosts had already undergone 1.5 years of training. It only took them 35 minutes to run a 5-kilometer, 4-kilogram, 2-footed cross-country run. It was her first time here, yet she could achieve such a result. It was indeed impressive of then. Finally, I didn't hear you say you wanted to chase her away. The big shark laughed. He even whistled happily. He had said last night that the female soldier sent by the army was not bad. See, he was right. Chapter 1251. The slender figure was getting closer and closer. Her facial features gradually became clearer, until she stood straight in front of Li Jinyan. She raised her hand and saluted. Yi Qian, reporting. Completed the 5,000-meter cross-country run. The group of rough-sitting water ghosts looked at each other. Then, they slightly closed their legs together in a reserved manner. A faint smile appeared on their faces as they lowered their heads and silently prepared breakfast for the soldiers who hadn't arrived yet. Dozens of men had an unusually large appetite. They did not have rice, noodles, or dumplings to fill their stomachs. They only had sashimi and snail slices. It was easy for them to get hungry and feel nauseous. Li Jinyan's first reaction when he saw Yi Qian was not to answer. Instead, he glanced at all the water ghosts like a cold arrow. When he saw that they were all obedient and did not look straight at her, he calmly retracted his gaze. Just as De Xia had said, the new female soldier Yi Qian was indeed beautiful. The most beautiful thing about her was her eyes, which were as bright as the morning star. He raised his hand and saluted Yi Qian back. His voice was cold and monotonous. Return to the team and rest. Yes, sir. Yi Qian, who had been staring straight at him, simply turned around. She changed her special shoes to one side and looked around. When she saw a familiar figure, she walked over with a smile. Big whale, is there anything I can help you with? After breakfast, they rested for a certain amount of time before diving into the 500-meter deep water. The water ghosts, who were all wearing tight black rubbered diving suits, saw Yi Jian walking straight to the whale from the corner of their eyes. A few of them coughed a few times as if their throats were itchy. Li Jinyan's cold gaze swept over them. When he saw the fake coughing water ghost, he shrunk his neck and silently stared at the task at hand, preparing breakfast. You know me. How did you know? The big whale was no less surprised than his comrade. Hearing the meaningful fake cough, he hurriedly stood up. It was broad daylight, and he didn't know where to put his hands and feet. In the end, he put them on his lower abdomen. Cough, at least he could block it. When the female soldiers arrived, for the first time, it was not the female soldiers who were embarrassed. Instead, it was the male soldiers who were wearing tight-fitting diving suits. The suits showed off their figures too much. All the men were embarrassed. With a slight smile on his face, Yi Qian did not seem to notice the whale's movements. He smiled and said, "Judging from your figure and the way you looked at me when I came over just now, it was as if you were looking at someone familiar. So, I guess you must be the whale. Have a seat. If you need anything from me, just let me know." As he spoke, he pulled out a combat dagger from his waist and pointed at the giant clams that had not been pried open. "Do we need to pry open these too?" "Oh, yes, yes. If you're hungry, you can eat first." As expected of a female soldier with a high IQ. She did not even see the whale's face last night, but today she could tell that he was the whale based on his figure and eyes. Her observation skills were very strong. The whale watched as Yi Qian skillfully cut open the giant clams. She did not peel off the whole clam to remove the inedible parts, leaving the white and fresh clam meat. She slowly cut the clam meat with the dagger in her hand. Then, she cut off the bottom of the clam meat horizontally. A giant clam was finished in less than 2 minutes. This method of cutting is rare. The whale thought it was interesting. There was no need to cut it into slices. Instead, she cut it into circles. When she ate, she could lift one end of the clam meat and eat it like noodles. "I want to learn this method too. It can be useful in the future." "Where did you learn it?" Don't underestimate the conversation. At this moment, the whale had already started to ask questions. Chapter 1252. The best and most direct way to understand a person's situation was to chat. It seemed like a normal conversation, but as long as the other party could answer your question, even if the other party only said a few vague words, you could get the information you wanted. Without a doubt, the great whale was a water ghost who was good at chatting. He first praised Yi Qian to create a kind impression. Then he laughed and changed the topic to why Yi Qian was so good. It must be because he had similar training in the past. Otherwise, how could he handle these giant clams? Most importantly, his questions were rough but detailed. He only asked how Yi Qian was able to handle the giant clams and didn't mention training at all. It was impossible to tell that he was asking about Yi Qian's personal situation. When Yi Qian heard this, his eyes narrowed slightly, but the smile on his face didn't change. He answered casually, "I used to play by the sea for a while and stayed on a deserted island for a few nights." The calm answer made the great whale laugh. The female soldier was very alert. Her answer was the same as not answering at all. She even told him that she knew what he wanted to ask. "Forgive me, I'm used to it." As he spoke, his laughter became softer. He moved closer to Yi Qian and said softly, "We can find out whatever we want from that group of soldiers who ran over. Our captain was so angry. I don't know how they were taught in the original army. They don't have any sense of confidentiality. Unlike you, you know what I want to do the moment I open my mouth." The great whale was a native of the sea. His skin was tanned and had a metallic luster in the faint morning sun. When he laughed, his white teeth flashed, making Yi Qian think of the great white shark of the deep sea. If he was careless, he would be bitten and unable to escape. "When you open your mouth, I feel like there are traps everywhere." Yi Qian, who was slicing the fish quickly, cut the white and tender fish slices until they were as thin as cicada's wings. He didn't even have to look at the fish. When he raised his head and spoke, the fish slices were cut and his words were finished. The dagger used in combat inadvertently swept past the great whale's eyes, leaving only a faint smile in her eyes. The great whale suddenly felt a chill in his heart. It was true that the female soldier was beautiful, but she was a poisonous flower with thorns. He couldn't touch her. There was no point in continuing to ask. He believed that he wouldn't be able to get anything out of him. The whale, whose intentions had been exposed, did not look embarrassed at all. He replied calmly, "Not at all. I just wanted to know more about you since we'll be training together in the future." Yi Qian smiled but did not say anything. Coincidentally, the male soldiers who had fallen behind her came back one after another. The great whale stood up and said, "I'll go over and take a look. You don't have to finish everything by yourself. Ask them to come back and get some. You can't let the male soldiers do whatever they want. They'll just take advantage of the situation." The rest of the frogmen looked at each other and had a new understanding of the new female soldier. Big Whale was the team's informant. There was nothing he couldn't find out, but he had never left empty-handed like this. The female soldiers sent by the army for training could not be underestimated. Yi Qian didn't care what kind of impression her arrival would leave on the water ghosts. She only knew that she didn't like being questioned at all. Once there were signs, they had to be strangled to death from the start. Demon King, things aren't settled yet. The great whale, who had found an excuse to leave, came to Li Jinyan, who was sitting on a reef and looking out at the sea. With a serious expression, he said, "She also warned me. She used the combat dagger in her hand to tell me that she doesn't like me asking around." Chapter 1253. The sun had completely risen above the surface of the sea, and the waves were sparkling under its light. It was as if there were boats passing by on the coastline, and they could faintly hear the sound of sirens from the reef island. Li Jinyan looked indifferent for a long time before he opened his mouth and said, "She was sent here by Xia Jinyuan himself. If you can get information out of her so easily, he won't think highly of her." His words shocked Whale so much that he almost fell off the reef. "Xia Jinyuan personally sent her here. Devil King, are you kidding me?" Whale's serious expression instantly changed to one of shock, and he said in a wrong tone, "You and he fought to the death in the past, and we were neck and neck. You knew that she was brought here by him, so how could you bear to let me ask for a rebuff?" He wanted to cry. "Even if you want to trick your comrades, you shouldn't do it like this." Who was Xia Jinyuan? He was the only person who the Devil King had acknowledged as a strong opponent. The only person who had publicly said that he had no confidence in winning against him. As for himself, sigh, it was better not to mention him. He was defeated by Xia Jinyuan. Although he was no longer in the water ghoul team, there were always traces of his existence. The great whale heaved a long sigh and rubbed his chest. His voice sounded a lot older than before. "My chest is stuffy. I'm so embarrassed. I don't have the face to see her. Last night, he had volunteered to find out if there was anything about the female soldier that wasn't written in the information. He had even thought that he was smart enough to ask her about her skills in cutting giant clams, and whether she knew a high-ranking naval officer. After being seen through, he still didn't give up and asked if she had such a strong sense of confidentiality, had she read their information in advance. The topic continued to circle back to the previous inquiry. Because of the female soldier who could see the information of the Storm Amphibious Frogman assault team, even if the information said that her mother was a martyr and her background was nothing special, he would not believe it was true. She knew everything about the two tests, and to be honest, he was a little embarrassed at that time. At the same time, he felt embarrassed that he had displayed his slight skill in front of an expert. When the last two soldiers returned, Li Jinyan, who had jumped down from the reef, replied calmly, "You were so enthusiastic last night that I didn't have the heart to discourage you. It just so happens that I also want to see how powerful the female soldier sent by Xia Jinyuan is. Since you volunteered, it saves me the trouble of finding someone else." He almost vomited blood. The whale felt its chest tighten even more. Li Jinyan's eyes darkened. He needed to reassess Yi Qian's position. It could be seen that her physical fitness had already surpassed the 24 soldiers who had entered the second batch of eliminations. It just so happened that physical fitness was the most important stage for the frogmen and played a very important role in their training. Through the analysis of the soldiers' physical fitness, they could make a preliminary judgment on whether the soldiers were suitable to stay and continue training, and whether they could continue fighting fatigue. This was the most basic entry. Today, it could be seen that Yi Qian's physical fitness was on the high side and met his basic requirements. However, he couldn't be completely sure whether she met the requirements. After all, it was only her first day of training, and her body was in an excited and energetic state, while the male soldiers had been training for more than a month. The shrimp, who was in charge of observing, trotted over. He was also cross-country with the frogmen, and his face was very inconspicuous. He looked a little like a fisherman who made a living out of the sea. When he ran up to Li Jinyan, his calm eyes suddenly changed. From an ordinary fisherman, he became a real naval soldier. Camouflage was also a skill that all water ghosts had to know. Chapter 1254. Li Jinyan stopped in his tracks when Prawn came over. He glanced coldly at Yi Qian, who was chatting with his teammates, and signaled for Prawn to follow him to a secluded area to talk. "Demon King, I suspect that Yi Qian has undergone very strict training. I'm afraid that none of the 24 soldiers are her match," Prawn said in a deep voice. "Her stamina is very good. She didn't even stop to rest for a second during the cross-country run." Prawn said in a deep voice, his admiration for Yi Jian was evident in his tone. "Also, she is very familiar with the terrain and landscape. She knows very well which way is the fastest and which way is likely to take a detour and waste her time. My opinion is that she shouldn't be a burden. She might even be able to surpass the 24 recruits." A 5,000-meter cross-country run had once again shown one of the water ghosts how strong Yi Qian was. Li Jinyan's cold and handsome face revealed a hint of contemplation. He said to Prawn, "We can't rush to a conclusion yet. Later, we still have to do a hypoxia and high C02 endurance test. After these two tests, we can decide whether she can stay or not. It's better to play it safe. After all, she's a living person in our team. We can't let anything happen to her." Yi Qian, who was chatting with the water ghosts, didn't know that she had become the topic of conversation for the Storm Amphibious Frogman assault team. At this time, she was answering a question from a marine. "I'm not a recruit. I often train with weights on my legs, so I don't feel much when I run." Didn't they want to know where she came from and who she was trained under? Then she might as well tell them openly and let them guess for themselves. Whale, who had already walked over, happened to hear this sentence. He stopped in his tracks and smiled bitterly. This was great. For the rest of the training, he wouldn't be able to talk much in front of Yi Qian. Why aren't you going over? Are you done eating? Big Shark, who had come to Yi Qian for hypoxia training, patted his comrade's shoulder. When he saw the bitter smile on his comrade's face, he asked, "You don't look too good. What problem did you run into?" The Great Mermaid was the team's instructor. She observed every word and action of her comrades and solved any potential problems at any time. He was the only one in the team who could give his opinion to Li Jinyan at any time and had the right to make decisions. I thought I was smart in front of Yi Qian. I feel a little embarrassed. The great whale sighed and shook his head. Great Mermaid, do you think I should apologize to her? The Great Mermaid raised her eyebrows and asked him calmly, do you still have any thoughts of looking down on her now? No, not even a little bit. I was scared by her. His words made the Great Mermaid laugh. That's right. If you don't agree with her, you can test Yi Qian's strength yourself. Otherwise, I'm afraid you'll have to discuss her background again. The Demon King deliberately arranged it because he heard you, Prawn, and the others say something you shouldn't have said. It just so happens that he also wants to know Yi Qian's strength, so he sent you guys there. She's strong, so it's good that you guys don't look down on her. If she's weak, you can ask her to go back. Whale's face was red as he scratched his head. His face was full of embarrassment. I have to apologize to her. Otherwise, I'll lose the integrity of a soldier. You're a soldier who dares to take responsibility for your actions. It's only right that you apologize. But let me tell you first. Big Shark was only a few meters away from Yi Qian when he spoke. When he looked over, he saw that she was already looking in his direction. Chapter 1255. Yi Qian had already stood up. Her instincts told her that the middle-aged man walking towards her could be one of the people in charge of the team. His position in the army was second only to Li Jinyan. Otherwise, the whale would not have consciously fallen half a step behind her. When the water ghosts who were talking to the whale saw the Great Mermaid coming over, they quickly lowered their heads. Their expressions were especially serious. They did not remind Yi Qian of the Great Mermaid's identity. The Demon King did not introduce Yi Qian this morning. There seemed to be a deeper meaning behind it. Even when they were chatting just now, they did not mention their code names. The soldiers who had eaten a mouthful of fish stood up and smiled. Vice Captain, do you have any orders for us? Vice Captain, I'm panicking when I see you smiling so happily. Just say what you want to say. Don't make me laugh in the middle of it. I really can't take it if you suddenly magnify it, said a soldier from the northeast. He was also the only northerner in the team. The Great Mermaid patted him on the shoulder and laughed. Good. Don't change the training later. 500 meters armed swim. Eat more, or you won't have the strength to swim. Then I'm relieved, hee. The northeast soldier was finally relieved. Ever since he came here for the Frogman selection, he had been living in fear every day. He was afraid that something would happen. His heart could not take it. He was not the only one who heard it. The other 23 soldiers all heard it. They all breathed a sigh of relief in unison. It was the vice captain of the Storm Brigade. Yi Qian, who had a slight smile on his face, looked at the middle-aged man who was chatting with the soldiers and walked up to him. Vice Captain, hello. Little Yi, you did well this morning. The Big Mermaid, who looked more mature and capable than the group of young soldiers, looked at Yi Qian with a pair of bright eyes. She didn't lose her friendliness at all as she said, what you did has truly stunned us. Very few female soldiers are as capable as you. Vice Captain, you flatter me. I just started a few years earlier, so I have the advantage in terms of time. If I only had half a year, I wouldn't have been able to run even if I wanted to. As soon as he finished speaking, the soldiers and water ghosts who were chatting with Yi Qian just now all laughed kindly. Vice Captain, the female soldier has arrived. You can't be biased because of this. Shoo, shoo, shoo. Does Yi Qian need to be biased? She's been in the army longer than us. Amazing. You guys better hurry up and eat your fill. The Demon King is waiting for you in front. The Great Mermaid, who was usually kind, smiled. After she finished speaking, she saw a hint of respect on the faces of the soldiers. She couldn't help but smile even more. Yi Qian, on the other hand, found it interesting. His vice captain had an amiable personality, which complemented the cold-faced Li Jinyan. Little Yi, come here for a moment. There's something I need to discuss with you. After talking to the soldiers, the Great Mermaid lowered her voice and said to Yi Qian, you can't directly participate in water-related training for now. Come with me to do 2 tests first. Yi Qian, who was mentally prepared, nodded slightly and left with the Big Mermaid. Hypoxia and high CO2 are essential tests for us. Before you came here, you should know that the danger of frogmen is different from that of the army. We're carrying out a mission in the water. The moment we enter the water, it's the same as having 1 foot in the door of hell. While we're diving in the deep sea, there's the danger of crushing our lungs and drowning at any time. If the soldiers have outstanding hypoxia and high CO2 resistance, even if it's only for 30 seconds, there's still a chance of survival. As she spoke, she brought Yi Qian to the back of the reef island. They stepped onto a small path that led to the other side of the island. Chapter 1256. The two in front talked as they walked. They didn't seem to notice that there was a living person following them. They didn't even look back as they walked from the front to the back of the reef island. When they reached the back of the reef island, the vice captain pointed at a black reef island that extended into the sea. She smiled at Yi Qian and said, we have to go to the front. We need to wade in the water. Be careful when you go in. Be careful not to slip. Okay. Yi Qian knew that he was undergoing a training test. He didn't ask any questions and just followed the vice captain. As for what he said, she just needed to listen and do as she was told. The Great Mermaid was a little surprised. This girl who wasn't even considered a female soldier always gave people surprises. Just like now, when the male soldiers who were selected from the Navy came back here, they couldn't help but ask questions like, why are you going into the water? But she didn't seem to be curious at all. She completely followed the saying, a soldier's duty is to obey orders. She didn't reject the arrangements made by the higher-ups. It wasn't that he didn't read her information. Like the Demon King, he was also suspicious of the female soldiers that the army suddenly sent over. Even before this morning, he was wondering if he should arrange a ship in advance to send the female soldiers back. Who knew that reality would teach him a lesson that left a deep impression on him and made him realize that he was too narrow-minded. Before seeing it with your own eyes, you shouldn't jump to conclusions easily. The Great Mermaid looked at the 2 people in front of her who seemed to have forgotten about her. She was so embarrassed that she wanted to carry the oxygen tank and dive as far away as possible. However, he still understood why the vice captain did this. She wanted him to lower his head first so that Yi Qian would feel better. In fact, Yi Qian didn't take the Great Mermaid's probing to heart. She had warned him and the other party immediately stopped. The matter at that time was already resolved. She wasn't petty enough to make her comrade lower his head and apologize to her. Seeing the vice captain wading into the water with her shoes on, Yi Qian, who was about to take off his shoes, smiled and followed her. The whale didn't get the order from the mermaid to leave. Seeing this, he smiled bitterly and followed the mermaid into the water. It seemed that if the mermaid didn't talk to him, the mermaid wouldn't let him leave. Their comrades naturally knew what each other was thinking. In fact, the Great Mermaid was also anxious. He didn't expect that Yi Qian hadn't said a word to the great whale even though the three of them had been walking for more than 10 minutes. It was obvious how angry she was. When the Great Mermaid saw this, she sighed softly in her heart. Standing in the cool seawater, she said to Yi Qian, "Little Yi, this morning the great whale tested you with my intentions. He was just following my orders. I know you are angry. Vice Captain, are you mistaken about something?" Yi Qian did not let him finish. She already knew what he was going to say halfway through. She said helplessly, "I didn't take what happened this morning to heart. If you didn't mention it, I would have already put it aside. Also, I need to make it clear to you that I am not angry about this matter, and there is no such thing as anger." Her gaze was honest and there was nothing strange on her face. Her eyes were as clear as the surrounding seawater, and she could even see her own reflection in them. That magnanimity instantly made the Great Mermaid realize that she had once again misunderstood. The Great Mermaid, who had been in the military for so many years, had never been embarrassed. But now, she was blushing. Chapter 1257. Yi Qian then said, "I came from the army, and I'm a female soldier. Suddenly coming under Demon King Li's command for training will indeed surprise everyone, because everyone knows how strict Demon King Li's training is. The difficulty is so great that even the male soldiers' expressions change. Vice Captain, I understand that you all have certain concerns. Because I understand, I've never asked what kind of training you all need me to do, or where you're taking me. I'll obey whatever arrangements the team has for me, and try my best not to bring unnecessary trouble to the team. Just like when you said that you still need to give me a test, I immediately came with you. I think I've already used my actions to tell you that my arrival won't cause any trouble to the team, nor will it cause any trouble for the team. Whatever arrangements the team has for the male soldiers, they can make the same arrangements for me. Ever since I knew that I needed to train with the amphibious frogmen, I've never thought of doing anything special in the team, and I've never thought of leaving so easily in the face of difficulties. In my heart, I've always believed that as a female soldier, I can do the same thing that the male soldiers can do. Furthermore, I'll strive to be the best, and I'll definitely not be a burden to the team, nor will I embarrass the team." After saying so much in one breath, Yi Qian's meaning was very clear. She hoped that in the upcoming training, the male soldiers in the team wouldn't look at her as if she were a female soldier. She also hoped that she wouldn't always think that she was weak because she was a female soldier, and that she needed the male soldiers to give in and take care of her. The big merman naturally understood. As Yi Qian spoke, his expression became more and more serious. When she finished speaking, the big merman knew that he had made a big mistake. He had underestimated the female soldier in front of him, who had a proud and unyielding character. Standing in the sea, he straightened his back and said in a deep voice, "I'm very sorry, Yi Qian. I apologize for my self-righteousness. Please forgive me for my ignorance. Vice Captain, you're exaggerating. You don't know me well, so it's normal for you to misunderstand." Yi Qian smiled. Although there were some unfair things in the army, and some bad people existed, so far, she had only met soldiers with iron bones and righteousness. Every single one of them was a man of indomitable spirit. Every single one of them was an indomitable spirit. She turned around and looked at the increasingly uncomfortable whale. She smiled and said, "I thought you came here to test me. I really didn't take what happened this morning to heart. Although you didn't take it to heart, I still need to apologize to you." Hearing her speak, the great whale heaved a long sigh of relief. He said slowly, "I really shouldn't have tested you this morning. I'm sorry, Yi Qian." Yi Qian sometimes felt helpless against their honesty. He waved his hand and said, "You have your own responsibilities. You don't need to apologize to me. If my actions caused you to misunderstand, I should be the one apologizing to you. Why don't we stop here and not mention it again? Look, we've wasted a few minutes standing here. Let's get down to business first." Yi Qian was quick to deal with major issues, not to mention small issues that she didn't even take to heart. Seeing that the two of them looked so serious that it seemed like they couldn't get over it, she decided to wade into the water and walk forward. As soon as she took a step, the two of them immediately reacted and said in unison, "Don't go astray." Yi Qian immediately stopped and looked up at the vice-captain, who was only an arm's length away from her. He said in a low voice, "There are coastal defenses below." Chapter 1258. Since this was the training ground of the Storm Brigade, how could there not be any underwater defenses? Moreover, they were heading to the training ground of the Storm Brigade. Yi Qian did not move again. She followed closely behind the Great Mermaid until they were about 5 meters away from the end of the reef. There was a natural cave before they stopped. The Great Mermaid stepped onto the reef covered with conch shells, and Yi Qian followed after her. They walked into the cave, and it felt like they were walking into the hinterland of the reef. When they walked in, they realized that there was something special about the cave. The cave was not naturally formed, but built. The entrance of the cave was low, and the direction of the cave was upward. Standing in the cave, they could hear the sound of seawater, but there was no seawater flowing in. "This is one of our training rooms. After a week of training outside, all members will come here for hypoxia testing and training." Opening a steel door, the Great Mermaid pulled open the main switch. The Great Mermaid motioned for Yi Qian to come in. "Later, we will simulate the oxygen concentration at high altitudes. Put on the helmet." She pointed at a transparent helmet that looked like an astronaut's, but there was a long breathing tube in front of the helmet. She motioned for Yi Qian to put it on. "By reducing the oxygen concentration in the air, we will first see if you have any extreme reactions to hypoxia." After that, the Great Mermaid smiled and said, "But I think you will have no problems." Her data showed that she had undergone training on the plateau, so there was no problem with her body. She would definitely have no problems with her first hypoxia test. Yi Qian's eyes were already looking around. She had never seen the auxiliary equipment used for hypoxia training. She knew that she would have to enter this hypoxia training room in the future. As they spoke, the hypoxia test began. Just as the Great Mermaid said, Yi Qian had no problems with this test. The Great Mermaid recorded everything and said to the Great Mermaid, "You can proceed to the next test." The Great Mermaid nodded and said seriously to Yi Qian, who looked normal, "Frogmen need to be completely hypoxic for 5 minutes to pass. If you feel any discomfort later, just give us a signal. We will also follow the instructions on the equipment to ensure your safety." On the other side, Will had already taken 2 auxiliary training instruments specially designed for ischemia tolerance and hypoxia tolerance and tied them to Yi Qian's left and right arms. Then, it pressurized the instruments to 220 mm of mercury, so that the upper limbs would experience temporary ischemia for a few minutes. As the breathing mask was removed, Yi Qian, who was wearing a helmet, entered a completely vacuum environment. There was no transition, and he directly entered an oxygen-free environment. 2.5 minutes had passed. Yi Qian's complexion was still normal for the time being. Sitting beside the monitor that was connected to the instrument to record various parameters, the whale's eyes stared at it without blinking. He looked at the numbers that were displayed in green, and then looked at the time that had passed. It had been 3 minutes. It wasn't because Yi Qian's anaerobic test had been going on for 3 minutes. Even though her data had changed, it wasn't the limit yet. Normal people could only go on for 1 to 2 minutes at most, but she had already gone on for 3 minutes. Wait a little longer, wait a little longer. If it was still the same after 4 minutes, then she would be the one with the best results among this batch of soldiers. Someone pushed the door open and walked to the side of the whale, who had a solemn expression and a hint of excitement. How many minutes has it been? It was Li Jinyan's voice. The parameters only started to change after 3.5 minutes. Even though the whale spoke in a low voice, it wasn't difficult to hear the excitement in his voice. Demon King, I bet that Yi Qian can definitely last for more than 4 minutes. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.